They told Reed Dalton the girl was deaf, broken, worthless, sold like cattle under the merciless Sierra Luce sun. But when his boots scraped the dry earth, her eyes snapped toward the sound with the precision of a hawk tracking prey. In that single, impossible moment, he knew she could hear everything. What he didn't know was that buying her freedom would unleash a war, unravel a web of lies, and force a silenced girl to scream loud enough to shatter the desert itself. Stay until the end and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The desert had a way of making men smaller. It stripped away pretense, reduced pride to dust, and left only the raw truth of survival beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Reed Dalton had learned this lesson over 37 years of hard living, his hands calloused from wire and leather, his face weathered like the canyon walls that surrounded his ranch. He'd come to Sierra Luce that scorching afternoon in late August for salt blocks and barbed wire, mundane necessities that kept his cattle alive and his fences standing. He hadn't come looking for trouble, and he certainly hadn't come looking for redemption. The town square shimmered in the heat, waves of distortion rising from the packed earth like ghosts. Adobe buildings lined the plaza, their walls the color of dried blood in the afternoon light. Reed tied his horse, Copper, to the hitching post outside Hernandez's general store, the animal's flanks dark with sweat despite the slow ride in. The street was busier than usual, which struck him as odd for a Wednesday. Clusters of men gathered near the mission bell, their voices carrying that particular timbre of anticipation that preceded either a hanging or a carnival. Reed ignored them, pushing through the store's heavy door into the relative cool of the interior. The familiar smell of coffee, leather, and lye soap greeted him. Miguel Hernandez stood behind the counter, his usual easy smile notably absent. "Afternoon, Miguel," Reed said, pulling a folded list from his shirt pocket. "Need to stock up before the fall." Miguel's eyes darted toward the window, then back to Reed. "You picked a hell of a day to come to town, amigo." "That's so." Reed set the list on the counter. "Looks like any other day to me." "There's an auction." Miguel's voice dropped low. "Over at the municipal platform. Doña Marilla is selling off her stepdaughter." Reed's hand stilled on the counter. "Selling? You mean like property? Like livestock?" Miguel spat the words with disgust. "The girl's maybe 14, 15 years old. They say she's deaf, mute, useless for work. Marilla wants her gone before the next mouth to feed becomes too expensive." Something cold settled in Reed's chest. He'd heard of such things, desperate families selling children into servitude, cruel guardians disposing of burdens, but it belonged to darker times, to places where law hadn't quite reached. Sierra Luce had a sheriff, a judge, a mission with 3 nuns. It had civilization, or so he'd thought. "And nobody's stopping it?" Miguel shrugged, the gesture heavy with resignation. "Sheriff Valdez says it's a family matter. The girl has no voice to protest, no kin to speak for her. Marilla has papers showing guardianship. Legally," he trailed off. "Legally," Reed repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. He'd seen enough of law to know it protected property better than people, contracts better than conscience. He should have stayed in the store, should have bought his supplies, mounted Copper, and ridden back to the lonely sanctuary of his ranch where other people's nightmares couldn't touch him. Reed Dalton had spent the last 5 years building walls, not just the fence lines that bordered his land, but the emotional barriers that kept the world at a safe distance. After losing his wife Sarah to childbed fever and the baby son who'd never drawn a single breath, he'd learned that caring led to loss, and loss led to a pain that could break a man worse than any physical wound. But something pulled him toward that window. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's voice, soft with compassion, saying, "Reed, honey, we don't look away from suffering just because it's easier." Maybe it was the simple fact that he'd once had a daughter, for exactly 43 minutes, before God or fate or random cruelty took her away. Through the dusty glass, he could see the crowd gathering thicker now, a swarm of men in sweat-stained shirts and battered hats. Above them, the wooden auction platform stood like a gallows. "I need to see this," Reed heard himself say. Miguel's expression shifted to something between pity and respect. "Don't do anything stupid, amigo. Marilla has connections. Men who carry iron and aren't afraid to use it. Reed nodded once and stepped back into the heat. The crowd had formed a rough semicircle around the platform, maybe 40 men deep, their attention fixed on the figures at the center of this grotesque theater. Reed worked his way through the press of bodies, moving with the deliberate patience of a man who'd learned not to rush, not to draw attention. The smell of unwashed humanity, tobacco, and cheap whiskey thickened the air. On the platform stood 3 people. The first was Tomas Rourke, the town's unofficial auctioneer, a florid man with a voice like gravel rolling down a mountainside, who'd just as soon sell a human being as a horse if the price was right. The second was a woman Reed recognized as Doña Marila Ventano, widow of Carlos Ventano, who'd owned the second largest ranch in the territory before dying under circumstances the sheriff had ruled accidental, but locals whispered were anything but. Marilla wore black, as she had every day for the 3 years since Carlos's death, but there was nothing mournful in her bearing. She stood rigid as mesquite, her face sharp-featured and cold, a woman who'd learned to survive in a hard land by being harder than the land itself. Her eyes, dark as obsidian, swept the crowd with the calculating assessment of a card-sharp counting marks. But it was the third figure that froze Reed's breath in his chest. The girl stood slightly behind and to the left of Rourke, her bare feet dusty on the rough planks, her thin cotton dress faded to the color of old bone. Someone had bound her wrists with rawhide strips, the leather cutting into skin that showed the tanned evidence of outdoor work. Her hair, dark as a starless night, hung in a tangled curtain that partially obscured her face. But Reed could see enough to read the story written in her posture. Shoulders hunched inward, head bowed, body held with the absolute stillness of a creature that had learned the hard way that any movement could bring pain. "Gentlemen," Rourke's voice boomed across the plaza. "Your attention, please. We have here a unique opportunity for any man in need of house labor or field work. The girl you see before you is 14 years of age, healthy despite her afflictions, and accustomed to hard work." "What's wrong with her?" someone shouted from the crowd. Rourke smiled, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "The girl is deaf, completely so, and mute as well. Cannot hear a word you say, cannot speak a word in reply. Now, some might see this as a disadvantage, but I put it to you, isn't there something to be said for a servant who can't eavesdrop on private conversations? Who won't spread gossip through town? Who'll simply do the work put before her without complaint or backtalk?" Rough laughter rippled through the crowd. Reed felt his jaw tighten. "She's been raised by Doña Marilla here, who's been generous enough to feed and clothe the girl these past 6 years since her father passed on. But the Doña's resources ain't unlimited, and she's decided it's time the girl earned her keep in another household. Think of it as a transfer of guardianship, all legal and proper." "What's her name?" This from a broad-shouldered man near the front, his interest clearly piqued. Marilla stepped forward, her voice carrying despite its lack of volume. "Alara. The girl's name is Alara." She said it like the word tasted bad, like naming the girl gave her more humanity than Marilla wanted to acknowledge. "Can she cook?" someone called out. "She can be taught," Marilla replied. "She's not stupid, just unable to hear. She learns by watching, by example. She's been doing laundry, cleaning, basic chores around my household." "How much?" The question came from multiple directions. Rourke raised his hands. Now let's do this proper like. We'll start the bidding at $20. Who'll give me 20? Reed's stomach turned. $20. The price of a good saddle, less than what he'd paid for copper, for a human life. 20? A leather-faced prospector near the front thrust his hand up. 25! Another voice, this one belonging to Silas Crenshaw, who owned a cantina on the edge of town and had a reputation for working his girls until they dropped. The bidding climbed slowly. Reed watched, frozen between horror and the growing urge to intervene. He'd come to town with $63 in his pocket, money saved for supplies and winter preparations. It was all he had until the spring cattle sale. On the platform, the girl remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the planks at her feet. She gave no indication of hearing the bids, the crude comments, the speculation about what use she might be put to. She'd learned to disappear while still standing in plain sight, a survival skill that spoke to horrors Reed didn't want to imagine. $40, a new voice, harsh and eager. Reed turned to see Christo Madden, one of Marilla's ranch hands, a man known for a mean streak and hands too quick with a whip. Marilla's lips curved in something that might have been satisfaction. So that's the game, Reed thought. She's got her own man ready to buy the girl back, keep her under Marilla's control but make it look legal, like a legitimate sale. The bidding stalled at 40. Rourke scanned the crowd. $40? Going once?
Do I hear 45?
In the pause, a gust of wind swept through the plaza, hot and dry as fever breath, stirring up dust devils that danced between the buildings. The girl's hair lifted slightly in the breeze, and that's when Reed's boot shifted, just a fraction, scraping against the packed earth. The sound was nothing, barely audible even to Reed himself, lost beneath the murmur of the crowd and the whisper of wind. A faint rasp of leather sole on dirt. But the girl's head snapped up. Her eyes, dark and luminous, turned with hawk-like precision toward the exact spot where Reed stood, 15 feet back in the crowd. For one heartbeat, two, their gazes locked. He saw everything in that instant, intelligence burning behind the carefully constructed mask of docility, fear worn so long it had become a second skin, and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or hope, or simply the desperate acknowledgement of one trapped soul seeing another. She heard me, Reed realized with absolute certainty. The thought struck like lightning. She heard that sound, knew exactly where it came from, tracked it with the accuracy of someone whose hearing was not just intact, but sharply honed. The moment passed in seconds. The girl's eyes dropped back to the platform, her face reassuming its blank expression. But Reed had seen behind the curtain, and the knowledge changed everything. She wasn't deaf. The silence was a lie, which meant everything about this auction was built on deception. $40 going twice. Rourke's voice seemed to come from very far away. Reed's hand moved before his mind had fully processed the decision. He raised it high, his voice cutting through the crowd. $60. The plaza fell silent. Heads turned. Reed felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes, felt the shift in the air as the crowd reassessed, speculated, judged. On the platform, Marilla's face went rigid, her carefully controlled expression cracking for just an instant. Christo Madden turned, his hand dropping instinctively toward the gun at his hip. Rourke recovered first, his auctioneer's instincts overriding surprise. $60! We have $60 from the gentleman in the back! Now that's a serious bid, folks. Do I hear 65? Christo opened his mouth, but Marilla's hand shot out, gripping his arm with visible force. She leaned close, whispering something urgent. Christo's face flushed red, but he stayed silent. The pause stretched. Reed could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat trickling down his spine that had nothing to do with the heat. $60, going once. Marilla's eyes found Reed's across the distance. There was murder in that gaze, a promise of consequences that made his skin prickle with warning. But she didn't signal Christo to bid higher. Why? What calculation was she making? $60, going twice. The girl hadn't looked up again, but Reed could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her bound hands had clenched into fists. Sold! Rourke's voice boomed. To the gentleman for $60, sir, if you'll come forward to complete the transaction. Reed moved through the crowd, his legs operating on instinct while his mind reeled. What the hell had he just done? He'd bought a human being. The words tasted like ash even in thought. No, he'd bought her freedom, he corrected himself. That's what he had to believe, or else he was no better than the vultures who'd been bidding on her like she was livestock. Up close, the girl seemed even smaller, more fragile. She kept her eyes down as Reed approached the platform, her breathing shallow and controlled. The rawhide bindings had cut into her wrists, leaving angry red marks that made his hands curl into fists. Papers need signing, Rourke said cheerfully, pulling out a grimy ledger. Just a formality, you understand. Transfer of guardianship, all legal and proper. Reed's jaw worked. I want those bindings removed. Now. Rourke blinked. Well now, that's between you and your property once the sale's complete. Now. Reed's voice dropped to a tone that had once commanded men in the cavalry, a lifetime ago. Or I walk away and you can explain to Doña Marilla why the sale fell through. For a moment, Rourke's jovial mask slipped, revealing something calculating underneath. Then he shrugged and pulled a knife from his belt. "Christo, cut her loose." Christo mounted the platform with deliberate slowness, making a show of testing the knife's edge with his thumb. He leaned close to the girl, his voice low but audible. "You're gonna regret this, little mouse. Doña Marilla don't forget, and neither do I. Whatever hole you crawl into, we'll find you." The girl gave no sign of hearing, but Reed saw her fingers twitch just slightly. Christo cut the rawhide with 2 swift strokes. The girl's hands came free, but she didn't raise them, didn't rub at the abraded skin. She simply stood there, waiting for the next blow, the next order, the next cruelty. Reed signed the papers without reading them, scratching his name across the bottom of a document that reduced a human life to a transaction. He counted out $60 in gold and silver, each coin a weight lifted from his pocket and placed onto his conscience instead. "Pleasure doing business," Rourke said, making the money disappear with practiced efficiency. "She's all yours." The words made Reed's stomach turn. He looked at the girl, at Alara, really looked at her for the first time since mounting the platform. Up close, he could see the small scars on her arms, the healed-over split in her lower lip, the too careful way she held herself. This was a child who'd learned to expect violence, who'd armored herself in silence and stillness because any other response had been punished. "Can you walk?" Reed asked gently, then immediately felt foolish. If she was truly deaf, she wouldn't hear him. If she wasn't, if his instinct was right, she was still pretending. He settled for gesturing toward the platform steps, then toward where Copper stood waiting. The girl's eyes flicked up, met his for just a fraction of a second, then dropped again. She moved like water, fluid and silent, descending the steps with the grace of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. The crowd was dispersing, disappointed that the spectacle had ended without more drama. But Reed felt eyes on his back, felt the weight of Marilla's stare like a physical thing. He turned, found her standing at the platform's edge, Christo beside her like a loyal dog. "A word, Mr. Dalton." It wasn't a request. Reed gestured for the girl to wait by his horse. She obeyed instantly, moving to stand beside Copper with her head bowed, then turned to face Marilla. Up close, she was older than he'd thought, perhaps 50. Her skin lined from sun and hard living. But her eyes held no softness, no mercy. "You've made a mistake," she said softly. "That girl is damaged goods, deaf, mute, and stubborn as a stone. I tried to raise her right after her father passed, God rest him, but she's untrainable. You'll regret this purchase within a week." "Then why were you selling her?" Reed kept his voice neutral. Marilla's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Charity has its limits, Mr. Dalton. I fed her, clothed her, gave her a roof for 6 years out of respect for her father's memory. But I have my own children to think of, my own household to run. The girl needed to earn her keep elsewhere." "If she's so useless, why did your man look ready to bid higher?" The smile vanished. Christo was bidding for himself, not for me. He thought she might be trainable for certain tasks. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Reed felt rage rise hot in his chest, but he kept it leashed. "Well, she's my responsibility now. We'll be leaving." "Of course," Marilla stepped back. "But a warning, Mr. Dalton. The girl has a tendency to run away. 3 times she's tried to leave my ranch. Each time we brought her back. If she runs from you, remember that I have legal papers showing she was a ward under my care. If anything happens to her, there will be questions." The threat was clear. If Alara disappeared, Marilla would claim Reed had harmed her, would use the law Reed had just used to buy her freedom as a weapon against him. "Noted," Reed said curtly. He turned and walked back to where Alara stood beside Copper, the girl's eyes fixed on the ground. The horse, normally skittish with strangers, had lowered his head near her shoulder, breathing softly. The girl's hand had risen without conscious thought, hovering an inch from the animal's muzzle, not quite touching. It was the first voluntary movement Reed had seen her make. "You ever ridden a horse?" he asked, then again felt the foolishness of the question. But this time, after a brief hesitation, the girl nodded once. Just a tiny dip of her chin, barely perceptible, but there. Reed's heart kicked. She'd understood him. She'd heard and understood and responded. He kept his face neutral, aware that Marilla and Christo were still watching from the platform. "Good," he said quietly. It's a long ride back to my place. We'll need to stop for water and rest, but we should make it before dark if we leave now." He untied Copper's reins and swung into the saddle, then reached down to offer the girl his hand. She stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to decode some trick, some hidden cruelty. Finally, with visible hesitation, she placed her small, scarred hand in his. Her skin was warm, her palm calloused from work. Reed pulled her up behind the saddle in one smooth motion. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and sinew. He could feel her trembling, whether from fear or exhaustion, or simply the shock of sudden change, he couldn't tell. "Hold on to my belt," he instructed. "If you need me to stop, tap my shoulder twice. Understand?" Another tiny nod against his back. Reed turned Copper toward the east road, toward home. As they passed the general store, he saw Miguel standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The older man raised one hand in what might have been farewell or acknowledgement, or simply a gesture of resignation. The town fell away behind them, adobe and dust giving way to scrub brush and red rock. The sun had begun its slow descent toward evening, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and gold. The desert opened up, vast and empty, offering both sanctuary and danger in equal measure. They rode in silence for the first hour. The girl sat rigid behind him, her small hands gripping his belt with white-knuckled intensity, her body held as far from his as balance would allow. She was like a wild thing, Reed thought, trapped in a space with a predator, every instinct screaming to run, but nowhere safe to run to. He understood that wariness. Trust was a luxury, and she'd been given no reason to trust anyone, least of all a strange man who'd bought her like property. The road wound through a series of low hills, following the dried bed of what had been a creek before the summer drought. Reed kept Copper at an easy pace, mindful of the double burden. The horse's hooves kicked up small puffs of dust with each step, the only sound beyond the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a hawk hunting thermals. As the sun dropped lower, painting long shadows across the land, Reed felt the girl's death grip on his belt loosen slightly. Exhaustion was winning over fear. Her head drooped forward once, then jerked back as she caught herself falling asleep. "It's all right," Reed said quietly. "You can rest. I won't let you fall." No response, but a moment later he felt her weight shift, felt her head come to rest against his back. Her breathing slowed, deepened. She'd fallen asleep sitting up, her body's need for rest overriding conscious caution. Something in Reed's chest cracked open, just a little. This child had been through hell, was still going through it, yet her body still demanded sleep, still sought the smallest comfort available. There was a resilience in that, a stubborn refusal to break completely, that humbled him. The ranch came into view as the last rays of sunlight turned the sky to fire. It wasn't much, a small house, a barn in need of new shingles, a windmill that creaked in the breeze, corrals for the 20 head of cattle that represented Reed's entire fortune. But it was his, bought with blood and sweat, and the last of his military pension after he'd mustered out of the cavalry 5 years ago. He'd chosen this location deliberately, miles from the nearest neighbor, a place where a man could be alone with his ghosts without having to explain himself to anyone. Now, looking at it through the eyes of a traumatized girl who'd just been sold by the only family she had, he saw how isolated it truly was, how vulnerable. What the hell am I going to do with her? The question hit him like a fist. He had no plan beyond the immediate impulse to get her away from Marilla. He knew nothing about raising children, had no idea how to help someone who'd been brutalized into silence. His own grief was barely managed, kept at bay only through relentless work and carefully maintained solitude. But he'd made his choice on that auction platform, had spent the last of his money, and likely made himself an enemy in the process. There was no taking it back now. Reed dismounted first, then reached up to help the girl down. She woke instantly, her body going rigid again, eyes snapping open with the hunted look of someone jerked from sleep by violence. For a moment she seemed confused about where she was, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar landscape. "You're safe," Reed said, knowing the words were meaningless, but needing to say them anyway. "This is my ranch. You'll stay here." He led Copper to the barn, the girl following at a distance like a wary shadow. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and leather and horse greeted him. He stripped off Copper's saddle and bridle, rubbed the animal down, poured feed into the trough. The girl watched from the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light, ready to bolt at any moment. When he turned to leave, she pressed herself against the doorframe, making herself small, making space for him to pass without touching her. The unconscious gesture told him more than words could about what she expected from men. "Come on," Reed said gently. "Let's get you some water and food." The house was dark and cool, its adobe walls thick enough to hold off the worst of the day's heat. Reed lit a lantern, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. The interior was sparse, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a shelf with a few dishes and basic supplies. Through an open doorway, the girl could see a single room with a bed, neatly made. One bed, Reed realized. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, she could have it. He'd slept in worse places than the floor. He pumped water into a tin cup and offered it to her. She stared at it for a long moment, then took it with both hands and drank in long, desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin. When had she last had clean water? This morning? Yesterday? Reed pulled out the only other chair. "Sit," he said, gesturing. "I'll see what I can find for supper." His stores were low. He'd been planning to restock in town, but he found some beans, a heel of bread, and a small piece of salt pork. He set them on the table, pushing them toward the girl. She looked at the food, then at him, then back at the food, waiting for permission, waiting for the trap to spring. "Eat," Reed said. "It's yours." Still she hesitated. So Reed took a piece of the bread himself and ate it, demonstrating. Only then did she reach out, her movements quick and furtive, grabbing the food and pulling it close like an animal protecting its kill. She ate like someone who'd learned to eat fast before the food could be taken away, barely chewing, swallowing in hunks. Reed had to stop himself from telling her to slow down, that she'd make herself sick. She needed to learn he wouldn't take the food back, that meals here weren't something to fight over. When she'd finished, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the empty plate. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the questions Reed didn't know how to ask, and all the answers she couldn't or wouldn't give. Finally, Reed stood, moving slowly so as not to startle her. "You take the bed," he said, gesturing toward the other room. "I'll sleep out here. There's a bolt on the door. You can lock it from the inside if you want. I won't bother you." Her eyes lifted to his face, searching, calculating, looking for the lie. Reed met her gaze steadily. "I know you've got no reason to trust me, but I didn't buy you for anything except to get you away from that place. You're not a prisoner here. I don't know what you are yet, but you're not property." For a long moment, she simply stared. Then, with movements as precise as a ceremony, she stood, walked to the bedroom doorway, and paused. Her hand lifted, trembling, and pressed flat against the dirt floor near the threshold. In the soft earth, she traced letters with her finger. "Peligro danger." The word hung between them, stark and undeniable. A warning or a statement of fact. Reed couldn't tell which. But the fact that she'd written it, that she'd communicated deliberately, confirmed what he'd suspected since that moment in the plaza. She could hear, she could understand. And right now she was telling him that something was coming. Before Reed could respond, she stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. He heard the bolt slide home. A small sound, but definite. She'd locked him out. Or locked herself in. Reed stood in the dim kitchen, staring at the word written in the dirt, feeling the weight of consequences settling around him like dust. He'd saved her from one nightmare, but he had no illusions about what he'd started. Marilla wouldn't forgive the humiliation. Cristo had promised retribution, and the girl herself, Alara, was carrying secrets that could get them both killed. Outside, the desert night closed in, thick and dark. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. Reed extinguished the lantern and lay down on the floor near the stove, his gun belt within easy reach. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind against the walls. Twice he jerked awake, certain he'd heard hoofbeats, but found only silence. His mind churned through possibilities, through plans and contingencies, through all the ways this could go wrong. Just before dawn, as the first gray light began to seep through the windows, Reed heard the bedroom door open. Soft footsteps crossed the floor. He kept his breathing steady, feigning sleep, giving her space to move without confrontation. The footsteps paused beside where he lay. He felt her gaze on him, assessing, weighing. Then she knelt, and he heard the faint scratch of her finger in the dirt near his head. When her footsteps retreated and the door closed again, Reed opened his eyes. In the growing light, he could just make out new words traced beside where his head had lain. Gracias. Thank you. Such a small thing, 2 syllables of gratitude, but they carried the weight of hope, of a girl beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in the world wanted to hurt her. Reed closed his eyes again, but this time, exhaustion dragged him down into deep sleep. When he woke hours later, the sun was high and the house was silent. He rose stiffly, his back protesting the hard floor, and knocked gently on the bedroom door. "Elara? You awake?" No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked now. The room was empty, the bed neatly made as if no one had slept there. For one heart-stopping moment, Reed thought she'd run, thought he'd find her gone, swallowed by the desert, or worse, making her way back to Marilla's ranch. Then he spotted her through the window, a small figure standing by the windmill, her face turned up to watch the blades turn in the morning breeze. She'd found one of Sarah's old dresses in the trunk. He'd never been able to throw them away, and though it hung loose on her thin frame, it was cleaner than the rags she'd arrived in. Reed stepped outside, the morning sun already fierce. The girl turned at the sound of the door, her body tensing, ready for flight. "Morning," Reed said, keeping his distance. "You hungry?" A nod. Small, but there. "Come on then, let's see what we can scrape together for breakfast." They walked back to the house together. Not side by side, but not quite apart either. It was a start, Reed thought, a fragile, uncertain start to something he didn't understand yet and couldn't predict. But as he glanced back toward the road that led to town, seeing nothing but empty desert and sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still coming. That somewhere out there, Marilla was already making her plans. And the danger Elara had warned him about was riding closer with every passing hour. The first 3 days passed in a silence broken only by necessity. Reed worked the ranch with the steady rhythm of a man who'd long ago learned that idle hands invited dark thoughts, and Elara moved through the house like a ghost, present but never quite there. She cleaned without being asked, swept the floors until the packed earth gleamed, washed dishes with a meticulousness that spoke of punishment avoided through perfection. But she never made a sound, never met his eyes for more than a heartbeat, and never ventured more than a few yards from the house unless he was in sight. Reed gave her space, understanding that trust couldn't be demanded or rushed. He spoke to her anyway, narrating his actions as he worked, going to check the fence line along the eastern pasture, or copper through a shoe, need to fix that before it gets worse. Half hoping she'd respond, half afraid of what it would mean if she did. Because if she could hear, if she could speak, then her silence was a choice born from terror, and that made everything worse. On the 4th morning, Reed woke before dawn to find her already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the cold stove. The lamplight caught the hollows under her eyes, the sharp angles of her face that spoke of too many meals missed, too many nights spent listening for danger. "Couldn't sleep?" Reed asked, keeping his voice soft. She shook her head, the movement barely perceptible. He moved to the stove, building up the fire, setting water to boil for coffee. "Nightmares?" A longer pause this time, then another tiny nod. Reed poured 2 cups of coffee when it was ready, set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it like it was winter instead of the tail end of summer, absorbing the warmth. They sat in companionable silence as the sky outside shifted from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. "I had a daughter once," Reed heard himself say, the words escaping before he could call them back. "Just for a little while. 43 minutes, to be exact. She came too early, too small. Never even got to name her proper before." He stopped, surprised at the ache in his chest even after 5 years. "My wife Sarah, she held on for another day. But the bleeding, the doctor said there was nothing to be done." Elara's eyes lifted to his face, something shifting behind the careful blankness. Not quite sympathy, she'd probably never been allowed the luxury of sympathy for others, but a recognition, a shared understanding of loss. "Point is," Reed continued, "I know what it's like to feel like the world's ending, like there's no reason to keep breathing except your body won't let you stop. But here's what I learned. Sometimes you just gotta take it one sunrise at a time. Don't think about tomorrow or next week. Just get through today. She studied him for a long moment, then her hand moved to the table surface. With one finger, she traced 2 words in the thin layer of dust. 1 day. That's right, Reed said quietly. 1 day. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then a sound shattered it, the distant thunder of hooves, multiple riders coming fast. Reed was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that hung above the door. Alara's face went white, her body frozen in the chair. "Get in the bedroom," Reed ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "Lock the door. Don't come out unless I tell you it's safe." For once, she didn't hesitate. She moved like quicksilver, vanishing into the bedroom. Reed heard the bolt slide home just as the riders came into view, 5 men on horseback silhouetted against the rising sun. Reed stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready, and waited. As the riders drew closer, he recognized the lead horse, Christo Madden on a big roan gelding, flanked by 4 other men from Marilla's ranch. They weren't carrying rifles openly, but Reed could see the bulge of pistols under their jackets, the coiled readiness of men who'd been sent to do violence. Christo reined in 20 feet from the porch, his thin smile showing too many teeth. "Morning, Dalton. Nice place you got here. Little isolated, though. Long way from town if a man needed help." "Christo." Reed kept his voice neutral. "You're a long way from Marilla's spread. Lost?" "Not lost. Come to collect what's ours. I paid for the girl, fair and square. Got papers to prove it." Christo spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "See? That's where you're mistaken. Those papers say you bought guardianship, not ownership. Guardianship can be revoked if the guardian ain't fit. And Doña Marilla, she's worried about that girl's welfare. Worried you might not be capable of caring for a child with special needs. The girl's fine." "That's so." Christo leaned forward in his saddle. "Then let's see her. Let's make sure she's being properly looked after. You got nothing to hide. You won't mind us taking a look." Reed's finger tightened on the rifle. "You're not setting foot in my house." "Now that's suspicious talk," Christo said, his voice hardening. "Makes a man wonder what you might be doing to that girl that you don't want witnesses to see." The accusation hung in the air, calculated and cruel. Reed felt rage burn hot in his chest, but he kept it leashed. Getting angry was what they wanted, an excuse to escalate. "The girl's sleeping," Reed said evenly. "She's had a hard few days, needs rest. You want to check on her welfare, come back with the sheriff and a warrant. Otherwise, you're trespassing, and I'm within my rights to defend my property." One of the other riders, a scarred man Reed didn't recognize, reached for his gun. "Maybe we just take her and sort out the legalities later." "You pull that iron, you better be ready to use it," Reed said quietly. "And ready to explain to the sheriff why you started a gunfight over a girl who's legally under my guardianship." Christo held up a hand, stopping the scarred man's draw. "Easy, Tomas. Mr. Dalton here is right. We don't want trouble. We're just concerned citizens checking on the welfare of a vulnerable child." He turned his attention back to Reed. "But here's the thing, Dalton. Accidents happen on isolated ranches. Fires start, fences get cut, cattle wander off. Be a shame if misfortune found its way to your doorstep. That a threat? That's reality. You're out here alone with a girl who can't call for help, can't testify if something happens. Who's going to believe your version of events if things go wrong?" Christo's smile widened. "Think about it. Think about whether $60 was worth all this trouble." He wheeled his horse around, the other riders following suit. They left at a canter, kicking up dust that hung in the still morning air long after they disappeared over the ridge. Reed stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded completely, his heart hammering against his ribs. They'd be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but Christo's threat had been clear. Marilla wanted the girl back, and she wasn't going to let a little thing like legal papers stop her. The bedroom door creaked open. Alara emerged, her face pale as chalk, her whole body trembling. She crossed to the window, stared out at the empty landscape where the riders had vanished, then turned to Reed with eyes that held a terrible knowledge. "You knew they'd come," Reed said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "That's what you meant by Pellegro. Danger. You were warning me." Another nod. Then her hand lifted, trembling, and pointed toward her own chest, toward herself. The message was clear. I'm the danger. I bring danger with me. That's not your fault, Reed said firmly. Whatever Marilla wants with you, whatever you know or whatever you are to her, that's not on you. You're the victim here. Alara's eyes filled with something that might have been tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. Her hand moved again, this time tracing words in the air, her finger writing on an invisible slate. When Reed looked confused, she grabbed a piece of charcoal from beside the stove and knelt by the floor, writing quickly. They will kill you. Maybe, Reed admitted. But that's my choice to make, not yours. She shook her head violently, writing more words. Not worth it. Just a girl. Damaged. The words hit Reed like a fist. Damaged. Someone had taught her that word, had beaten it into her until she believed it, until it became the truth she carried in her bones. No, Reed said, kneeling down beside her. You listen to me, Alara. I don't know what Marilla told you, what she did to you, but you are not damaged. You are not worthless, and you are damn sure worth fighting for. She stared at him, her eyes wide and disbelieving. Then she wrote one more word. Why? Why indeed? Reed had asked himself the same question 100 times since that moment on the auction platform. Why risk everything for a stranger? Why spend his last dollar? Why invite violence and danger into the carefully ordered loneliness he'd built for himself? Because, Reed said slowly, working through the answer as he spoke, 5 years ago, I couldn't save my wife or my daughter. I couldn't stop them from dying, couldn't do anything but watch and feel helpless. Maybe that's not a good reason. Maybe it's selfish. But when I saw you on that platform, when I realized what you were, that you could hear, that you'd been pretending all this time just to survive, I couldn't walk away. I couldn't be helpless again. Alara's lips parted, and for a moment Reed thought she might speak, but then she closed her mouth, swallowed hard, and simply nodded once. It was acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion. Either way, it was something. The rest of the day passed in tense watchfulness. Reed worked close to the house, keeping his rifle within reach, his eyes scanning the horizon for riders. Alara stayed inside, but he could see her shadow moving past the windows, could feel her presence like a second heartbeat. She was listening, always listening, her ears tuned to dangers he couldn't yet hear. As the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, Reed was checking the barn when he heard it. A soft, low sound, almost musical. He turned to find Alara standing in the barn doorway, her hand outstretched toward Copper, who had lowered his massive head to snuffle at her palm. He likes you, Reed said quietly. She didn't startle at his voice, which told him she'd known he was there. Her hand moved to stroke Copper's muzzle, the gesture tender and practiced. You said you'd ridden before, Reed continued, moving slowly closer. Was that with your father? The smallest hesitation, then a nod. What happened to him? Your father? Her hand stilled on Copper's neck. When she looked at Reed, her eyes held depths of grief that no child should know. She pointed to herself, then pressed both palms flat against the ground. Dead and buried. Then she made a slashing motion across her throat. Someone killed him, Reed breathed. Jesus! And Marilla! Alara's hands moved rapidly, tracing more invisible words. When Reed shook his head, frustrated, she grabbed a stick and wrote in the dirt. Marilla married him. 6 months later, he died. Fell from horse. No one believed me. You think she killed him. A definite nod this time, fierce and certain. And that's why you stopped talking, because you knew, and speaking the truth would get you killed too. Yes. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture darker than Reed had imagined. Carlos Ventano, Alara's father, had married Marilla, probably a widow looking for security, a widower looking for help raising his daughter. 6 months later, Carlos was dead in what looked like a riding accident, and Marilla had inherited everything, the ranch, the money, and custody of a girl who knew too much. So she told everyone you were deaf, Reed said, working it through. Made you play the part so thoroughly that no one would ever take your word over hers. kept you close where she could watch you, but far enough from help that you couldn't escape. Alara wrote one more word, prisoner. Not anymore, Reed said firmly. We're going to figure this out. We're going to find a way to prove what happened, to get you free of her for good. She looked at him with something between hope and despair, like she wanted to believe but had learned better. Before Reed could say more, Copper's head came up sharply. His ears pricked forward. A heartbeat later, Reed heard it too, hoofbeats again, but different this time. Slower, just a single rider approaching cautiously. Reed grabbed his rifle and moved to the barn door. The rider came into view as the sun touched the horizon, a figure on a tired-looking mule, wrapped in the dusty brown robes of the mission. Sister Miriam, Reed breathed, recognizing the elderly nun who ran the small mission in Sierra Luce. He lowered the rifle and stepped out to meet her. The old woman dismounted stiffly, her weathered face lined with concern. Mr. Dalton, I hope I'm not intruding, but I had to come. I had to see if the girl was real, if what I heard was true. What did you hear? Sister Miriam's eyes found Alara, who'd emerged from the barn. The nun's face transformed, tears springing to her eyes. Santa Maria, she whispered. It is you. Little Alara, I feared. Alara stood frozen, her eyes wide. Then she took one step forward, then another, then she was running, throwing herself into the old woman's arms with a choked sound that might have been a sob. Sister Miriam held her tight, murmuring prayers in Spanish, rocking her like a child. Shh, niña, shh. You're safe now. You're safe. Reed watched the reunion, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. When they finally separated, both wiping tears, Sister Miriam turned to him with an expression of profound gratitude. Mr. Dalton, you've done a brave thing, a holy thing. This child, she stroked Alara's hair. I knew her father. Carlos Ventano was a good man, a godly man. When he died, when Marilla took her, I tried to intervene. But the law said Marilla was the legal guardian, and I had no proof of wrongdoing. The girl wouldn't speak, and everyone believed she was deaf. She's not, Reed said quietly. She can hear just fine. She's been pretending to survive. Sister Miriam nodded. I suspected as much. Carlos used to bring her to the mission every Sunday. She would sit in the front pew and listen to every word of the service. Such a bright child, so full of life. And then after he died, she trailed off, her expression darkening. She changed, became silent, closed in on herself. I tried to reach her, but Marilla stopped bringing her to Mass. Said the girl was difficult, that she needed strict discipline. Sister, Reed said carefully, Alara wrote something. She thinks Marilla killed her father. The old nun's face went pale. I wondered. God forgive me. I wondered. Carlos was an expert horseman. The idea that he would fall and break his neck on a gentle morning ride. It never sat right. But there was no evidence, and Marilla had powerful friends. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Can you testify to that? To your suspicions? Suspicions aren't evidence, Mr. Dalton. Without proof, without a witness willing to speak. Sister Miriam looked at Alara. Can you tell them, child? Can you find the courage to speak the truth? Alara's face crumpled. She shook her head violently, backing away. Her hands came up, fingers curling into claws, and a sound emerged from her throat. Low, keening, the sound of an animal in a trap. It was the first true sound Reed had heard her make, and it chilled him to the bone. She can't, Reed said, understanding dawning. They did something to her, Marilla or her men. Something that made speaking impossible, even if she wanted to. Sister Miriam's expression hardened with righteous anger. Then we find another way. There must be records, letters, something Carlos left behind. He was a careful man, kept detailed journals. If Marilla did kill him, there might be clues in his writings. Where would those journals be? At the ranch, in his study. But getting to them... The nun shook her head. Marilla guards that place like a fortress. No one goes in or out without her knowing. Reed looked at Alara, who had calmed slightly but still looked haunted. Did your father keep journals? She nodded. Do you know where they are? Another nod, more certain. Could you draw a map? Show me where in the house. Alara hesitated, fear and hope warring on her face.
Then she knelt and began drawing in the dirt with swift, sure strokes. The layout of a house emerged, rooms marked with careful detail, and a small X in what looked like a study. "That's a start," Reed said, "but getting in there, getting out with the journals without being caught or killed, that's another matter entirely." "Perhaps I can help with that," Sister Miriam said.
Marilla still maintains appearances, still comes to confession once a month. Her next confession is in 3 days. She'll be gone from the ranch for at least 2 hours. You'd help us break into her house? The old nun's smile was thin. I'd help you expose a murderer and free an innocent child. If that requires some creative interpretation of property rights, I trust God will understand my motives, if not my methods. Reed couldn't help but smile. 3 days, then. We'll need a plan, supplies, and a hell of a lot of luck. And horses, Sister Miriam added. Fast ones. Because once Marilla discovers what we've done, she'll come after us with everything she has. They spent the next hour planning, drawing maps, discussing contingencies. Alara participated with fierce intensity, her finger flying across the dirt, drawing details, marking dangers. It was clear she knew the ranch intimately, knew every entrance and exit, every guard's routine, every hidden corner where a person could hide. As the moon rose, Sister Miriam prepared to leave. She pulled Alara aside, speaking to her in low, earnest tones that Reed couldn't quite hear. When they embraced again, the old nun pressed something into Alara's hand, a small wooden cross on a leather cord. Your father gave this to me for safekeeping, Sister Miriam said, loud enough for Reed to hear. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to you. He wanted you to know he loved you, that he would always love you, no matter what. Alara clutched the cross to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her mouth opened, and Reed saw her struggle, saw her fight against whatever had stolen her voice. A sound emerged, raw and broken. Pa. Yes, child, Sister Miriam whispered. Yes. He's with God now, watching over you, and he would be so proud of your courage. After the nun left, Reed and Alara sat on the porch in the moonlight, the silence between them different now, companionable, almost peaceful. She wore the cross around her neck, her fingers touching it periodically, like a talisman. 3 days, Reed said quietly. We've got 3 days to prepare, to get ready for whatever comes next. Alara looked at him, and in the moonlight, her face seemed older, harder. She raised her hand and wrote one final message in the air, the gesture clear even without letters. Together. Together, Reed agreed. That night, Reed slept on the floor again, but this time Alara left her door open. Not an invitation exactly, but a statement of trust, a recognition that they were allies now, bound together by necessity and a shared enemy, and something else that neither of them could quite name. In the small hours before dawn, Reed woke to find her standing at the window, silhouetted against the stars, watching the darkness with the vigilance of a soldier on guard duty. He started to rise, to ask if she was all right, but she turned and looked at him, and he saw something in her face that stopped him. She was terrified, but she was also determined. Whatever came next, whatever violence or danger Marilla sent their way, this girl would face it. Not because she wanted to, but because she'd finally found something worth fighting for. Her voice, her truth, her freedom. And maybe, just maybe, a strange, lonely rancher who decided that saving one life might be enough to balance the scales of all the lives he couldn't save. The morning of the third day dawned clear and hot, the sun rising over the canyon like a promise or a threat. Reed and Alara worked through breakfast in silence, checking supplies, preparing horses. Sister Miriam would meet them at the crossroads at noon, and from there they'd ride to Marilla's ranch while she was at confession. As Reed cinched the saddle on Copper, he caught Alara watching him, her expression unreadable. She crossed to him, reached up, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she pressed her hand to his chest, right over his heart, and held it there. A gesture of gratitude, of trust, of connection. Reed covered her hand with his own. We're going to make this right, he promised, whatever it takes. She nodded once, fierce and certain, then turned to mount the second horse, a mare Sister Miriam had brought the night before, gentle but steady. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, leaving the ranch behind, heading toward danger and destiny, and the slim hope that truth, once spoken, could set them both free. The crossroads appeared as a shimmering mirage in the noon heat. Three paths converging in a patch of dusty earth marked by a weathered wooden cross that some long-dead traveler had planted as a marker or a prayer. Sister Miriam waited in the shade of a twisted mesquite, her mule tied nearby, her face shaded by the wide brim of her traveling hat. She stood as they approached, her expression grave with the weight of what they were about to do. "Marilla left for town an hour ago," the nun said without preamble. "I watched her carriage pass the mission. She had 2 men with her as escorts, but that still leaves at least 3 at the ranch, Christo and 2 others whose names I don't know." Reed dismounted, helping Alara down from her mare. 3 armed men against 1 rancher, 1 nun, and a girl. I've faced worse odds. "When you were in the cavalry, perhaps," Sister Miriam said sharply. "But that was years ago, Mr. Dalton, and you're not a young man anymore." No offense intended. "None taken, but the odds don't change what needs doing." Reed checked his rifle, made sure his pistol sat easy in its holster. "Alara knows the house. She'll guide us to the study. We grab the journals, and we're gone before anyone knows we were there." Sister Miriam's eyes moved to Alara, who stood silent and tense, one hand gripping the wooden cross at her throat. "Child, are you certain about this? Once we cross this line, there's no going back. Marilla will know it was you who led us there." Alara's jaw set with determination. She nodded once, fierce and final, then moved to Reed's saddlebag and pulled out the charcoal stick she'd taken to carrying. On a flat rock, she wrote quickly, "She killed my father. Time for truth." "Then God go with us," Sister Miriam murmured, crossing herself, "and God forgive us if this goes wrong." They rode in formation, Reed in front with his rifle across his saddle, Alara in the middle, and Sister Miriam bringing up the rear. The land rose and fell in gentle swells, ocotillo and prickly pear dotting the landscape like sentinels. In the distance, dust devils danced across the flats, and a hawk circled high overhead, its shadow racing across the earth below. The Ventano ranch appeared gradually, emerging from the heat shimmer like something conjured from memory. It was larger than Reed's spread by a factor of 10. The main house, a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof, surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and a barn that could shelter 20 horses. In the distance, cattle grazed in irrigated pastures that spoke of money and water rights that most ranchers could only dream of. This was what Carlos Ventano had built, what Marilla had inherited through marriage and possibly murder. They stopped on a rise overlooking the compound, studying the layout. 2 men were visible, one lounging in the shade of the bunkhouse, another working on a fence near the corrals. No sign of Christo, which worried Reed more than if he'd been in plain sight. "The study is on the east side of the main house," Alara wrote on her small slate board they'd brought for this purpose. "Window overlooks garden. Can enter there." "And if someone's inside?" Reed asked quietly. She hesitated, then wrote, "Hide until they leave. Or fight." Reed looked at this slip of a girl, barely more than a child, writing the words, "or fight," with the same matter-of-fact pragmatism that a soldier might use. What had Marilla done to her, that violence had become just another tool for survival? "We try to avoid fighting, if we can," Reed said firmly. "In and out, quiet as ghosts. Sister Miriam, you stay with the horses at the garden wall. If trouble starts, you ride for the sheriff in town, tell him everything. Don't wait for us." "I will not abandon you," the nun said stubbornly. "You'll do what needs doing to make sure the truth gets out," Reed countered. "That's more important than any of us." They approached from the east, using the rolls in the terrain to stay out of sight from the main compound. The garden wall was 8 feet of adobe brick, built to keep out rabbits and deer, with a wooden gate that hung slightly crooked on rusted hinges. Reed dismounted first, tested the gate. Locked, but the lock was old and loose. He pulled his knife, worked the blade into the gap, and felt the mechanism give way with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the afternoon quiet. The garden beyond was a riot of green in the midst of brown desert, fed by an irrigation ditch that ran from a spring higher in the hills. Roses climbed trellises, vegetables grew in neat rows, and fruit trees provided patches of shade. It was beautiful and incongruous, a piece of paradise maintained through control of precious water, and Reed wondered how many smaller ranches had died of thirst so Marilla could have her roses. The house loomed ahead, its whitewashed walls bright in the sun. The window Alara had indicated was shuttered but not barred,
opening onto a small veranda shaded by a climbing vine. Reed moved first, crossing the garden in a low crouch, his boots careful to avoid the gravel paths that might crunch and give them away. Alara followed like his shadow, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned to be invisible. At the window, Reed paused, listening. No sound from within. He tried the shutters. They swung open with barely a whisper, revealing a darkened room beyond. The window itself was unlatched, opening inward with a faint creak that made his heart hammer. He climbed through first, dropping into a crouch on the other side, his hand on his pistol. The room was exactly as Alara had described, a study lined with bookshelves dominated by a heavy desk of dark wood. Papers lay scattered across its surface, and the smell of tobacco and leather hung in the air. On one wall hung a portrait of a man Reed assumed was Carlos Ventano, dark-haired, strong-featured, with Alara's eyes looking out from the canvas with an expression of quiet dignity. Alara climbed through the window behind him, and her breath caught when she saw the portrait. She stood frozen, staring at her father's painted face, and Reed saw her lips move, forming words that made no sound. "Papa!" "Where are the journals?" Reed whispered urgently. They didn't have time for grief, not yet. Alara tore her gaze from the portrait and moved to the bookshelf on the right side of the room. Her hands traced the spines of books with the certainty of muscle memory, counting, searching. She stopped at a thick volume bound in brown leather, pulled it out, and revealed a hollow space behind it where 3 leather-bound journals sat stacked and waiting. Reed felt a surge of triumph. They were here, they were real. They might contain the evidence needed to bring Marilla to justice. He grabbed all 3, tucking them into the leather satchel he'd brought for this purpose. That's when they heard the footsteps. Heavy boots on tile, approaching from the hallway beyond the study door. Reed and Alara froze, eyes locked on each other. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and they heard the rattle of the doorknob turning. Reed moved fast, pulling Alara behind the desk, pressing her down into the knee space beneath it, covering her with his body. The door swung open, and Christo Madden walked into the room, carrying a bottle of whiskey and whistling tunelessly. Through the crack in the desk's modesty panel, Reed watched Christo cross to the liquor cabinet, pour himself a generous measure, and drop into the chair behind the desk, the very chair that now concealed 2 intruders pressed into the shadows beneath it. Christo's boots were inches from Reed's hand. The man reeked of sweat and tobacco and something sour that might have been fear or anticipation. Christo drank deeply, then set the glass down on the desk with a thunk. 3 more days, he muttered to himself. 3 more days and this whole mess is over. Girl disappears, unfortunate accident, Dalton gets blamed, and we're all rich as kings. Reed's blood ran cold. They were planning something, planning it for 3 days from now, planning to kill Alara and frame him for it. Christo stood abruptly, and for one heart-stopping moment, Reed thought he'd been spotted. But the man was just reaching for a cigar from the box on the desk. He lit it, puffing until the end glowed red, then walked back toward the door. "Better check the perimeter," Christo said to the empty room. "Make sure that fool Dalton hasn't gotten any smart ideas." The door closed. The footsteps receded. Reed waited, counting heartbeats, until he was sure Christo had left the house entirely. Then he and Alara scrambled out from under the desk, both breathing hard, both shaking with the adrenaline of near discovery. "We need to go," Reed whispered. "Now." They moved back to the window, but as Reed started to climb through, Alara grabbed his arm. She pointed frantically toward the desk, toward something Reed had missed in his haste. A ledger, thick and bound in red leather, with Marilla's name embossed in gold on the cover. "The ranch accounts?" Reed guessed. Alara shook her head, writing quickly on her slate. "Payments to sheriff, to judge, to doctor." Bribes. Proof of corruption, proof that Marilla had bought the very people who should have investigated Carlos's death. Reed grabbed the ledger, stuffing it into the satchel with the journals. The bag was heavy now, bulging with evidence, with the weight of truth that could destroy a powerful woman or get them all killed. They climbed through the window into the merciless sunlight of the garden. Sister Miriam stood by the horses, her face tight with tension. "Christo rode out toward the east pasture," she hissed, "but he could return any moment." They mounted quickly, Reed pulling Alara up behind him on Copper since speed mattered more than comfort now.
They urged the horses into a fast trot, then a canter, putting distance between themselves and the ranch house. Behind them, Reed heard a shout. Someone had spotted them, or found the open window, or simply sensed that something was wrong. "Ride!" Reed yelled, and they kicked the horses into a full gallop. The land blurred past, brown and gold and red, rocks and scrub, and the occasional twisted tree. The horses' hooves thundered like drums, and behind them more shouts rose, and then the crack of a rifle shot that kicked up dirt 20 feet to their left. They reached the canyon mouth where Reed had planned their escape route, a narrow defile that twisted through high rock walls, too narrow for riders to go more than two abreast, perfect for defense, if it came to that. They plunged into its shadows, the temperature dropping instantly as the stone walls cut off the sun. "Keep going," Reed shouted to Sister Miriam. "Follow the canyon north. It'll bring you out near the mission. Get to the sheriff. Show him what we found." "What about you?" the nun called back. "We'll slow them down. Give you time." Reed reined Copper to a stop, helping Alara slide down. "Go, sister. This only works if someone gets out with the evidence." Sister Miriam's face twisted with anguish, but she was practical enough to know he was right. She kicked her mule into motion, disappearing around a bend in the canyon with the precious satchel secured to her saddle. Reed turned to Alara. "Can you shoot?" She shook her head. "Can you reload?" A hesitation, then a nod. "Good enough." Reed pulled his rifle and his pistol, pressed the pistol into her hands. 6 shots. "When I fire the rifle, you reload it. Can you do that?" Her eyes were huge, terrified, but she nodded again. Her hands closed around the pistol grip with surprising steadiness. They took position behind a tumble of boulders that had fallen from the canyon rim sometime in the distant past, creating a natural barricade. Reed could hear horses approaching, could hear Christo's voice raised in anger, coordinating the pursuit. "How many?" Reed muttered, more to himself than to Alara. She held up 4 fingers. 4 riders. Christo and 3 others. Against one rancher with a rifle and a girl who couldn't shoot. The odds weren't good, but they didn't need to win. They just needed to buy time. The riders appeared at the canyon mouth, silhouetted against the bright sky beyond. Christo in front, the scarred man called Tomas beside him, and 2 others Reed didn't recognize. They slowed at the canyon entrance, sensing the danger of the narrow passage. "Dalton!" Christo's voice echoed off the stone walls. "You got nowhere to go. Canyon's a dead end about a mile north. You're trapped." Reed didn't answer, watching, waiting. Let them think he'd kept running, hadn't stopped to make a stand. Christo conferred with his men, then gestured. 2 of them, Tomas and a younger man with a bandana covering half his face, urged their horses forward into the canyon, moving slowly, weapons drawn. Reed waited until they were 30 yards away, well within rifle range, and fired. The shot cracked like lightning in the confined space, and Tomas jerked in his saddle, his hat flying off. Reed had aimed high deliberately, a warning shot, not trying to kill. Not yet. The riders scattered, diving off their horses, scrambling for cover. Return fire erupted, bullets ricocheting off stone with high-pitched whines that made Alara flinch and cover her ears. "Reload," Reed said calmly, ejecting the spent cartridge and passing the rifle to Alara. Her hands shook, but she worked the mechanism with fumbling competence, sliding a fresh round into the chamber and passing the weapon back. Reed fired again, this time targeting a patch of ground near where the bandana-wearing man had taken cover. Dirt and rock exploded, and the man yelped and scrambled further back. "You're just making this harder on yourself," Christo shouted. "You killed that girl, Dalton. We got witnesses who'll say they saw you beat her, saw you drag her off your ranch. You're finished." So that was the story they'd planned. Simple, brutal, effective. A man buys a vulnerable girl, takes her to his isolated ranch, and something terrible happens. No one would question it, especially with Marilla's money greasing the wheels of justice. "Reload," Reed said again, and Alara took the rifle with steadier hands this time. The standoff stretched. Christo's men tried twice more to advance, and twice Reed drove them back with carefully placed shots. He was running low on ammunition, maybe a dozen rounds left between the rifle and his pistol, but more importantly, he was running out of time. The sun was dropping toward evening, and Sister Miriam needed at least 2 hours to reach town. That's when Reed heard it,
a sound that didn't belong, coming not from the canyon mouth, where Christo waited, but from above. Scrambling sounds, rock sliding on rock. They were climbing, using the canyon walls to get above the barricade, to shoot down from a position Reed couldn't defend against. "Alara," Reed said urgently, "we need to move. Can you run?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "When I say go, you run north up the canyon. Don't stop, don't look back. Find Sister Miriam if you can, or hide if you can't. But whatever happens, don't let them take you. Understand?" Alara's eyes widened with understanding and horror. She shook her head violently, grabbing Reed's arm. "I'll be right behind you," Reed lied. "I just need to slow them down first. Go!" He stood, firing 3 rapid shots at the canyon mouth to keep Christo's men pinned, then shoved Alara toward the path north. She ran, her bare feet silent on stone, moving with the desperate speed of a hunted deer. Reed turned his attention to the canyon walls, spotting movement on the eastern rim. The younger man, rifle in hand, taking aim at Alara's fleeing form. Reed didn't think, didn't calculate, just fired. The shot took the man in the shoulders, spinning him around, sending him tumbling down the steep slope in a shower of loose rock and dust. The man landed hard 20 feet away, his rifle clattering across stone. He was alive but hurt, clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing steadily. Reed moved to him, kicked the rifle away, then kept running after Alara. Behind him, Christo's voice rose to a scream of rage. "After them! Kill Dalton! Bring me the girl alive!" The canyon narrowed ahead, the walls closing in until there was barely room for a horse to pass. Reed caught up with Alara, grabbed her hand, and pulled her faster. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain. Just a little further, just a little more time. They burst out of the narrow section into a wider space where the canyon forked. To the left, the path continued north toward the mission. To the right, it climbed steeply toward a series of ruins. An old windmill, long abandoned, its blades broken and still against the darkening sky. Reed made a split-second decision. "The windmill!" he gasped. "We can defend it. See them coming." They climbed, scrambling up the rocky path as the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. The windmill loomed larger, a skeletal structure of wood and rusted metal, surrounded by the crumbling foundations of what had once been a homestead. Someone had tried to make a life here, decades ago, and failed. Now it would serve as a fortress or a tomb. They reached the windmill as the last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. Reed dragged Alara behind the stone base, positioning himself where he could cover the approach path. 4 rounds left in the rifle, 3 in his pistol. 7 shots to hold off 4 men until darkness fell and they could escape under cover of night. Christo and his remaining men appeared at the base of the path, their horses lathered and blowing. They dismounted, approaching on foot now, using rocks and scrub for cover. Smart. Harder to hit, harder to track. "Dalton," Christo called out, "this is your last chance. Send out the girl and we'll let you live. You can ride away. Forget this ever happened." Reed didn't waste breath on a response. He fired instead, the bullet striking sparks off a rock near Christo's head. The man ducked back, cursing. "Have it your way," Christo shouted. "But when we dig your body out of those ruins, remember, you chose this." They came at twilight, 3 men moving in coordinated silence, using the failing light and the terrain to mask their approach. Reed tracked them as best he could, but the shadows were deepening, and his eyes weren't as sharp as they'd been 20 years ago. A shot rang out, the bullet striking the stone near his head with a crack that sent chips flying. Reed ducked, returned fire, heard a yelp of pain. Got one of them, at least winged him. 2 rounds left in the rifle. Another shot, this one from a different angle. They were flanking, using the ruins for cover, closing the net. Reed shifted position, trying to cover multiple approaches at once, knowing it was impossible, knowing he was running out of time and ammunition and luck. That's when Alara moved. She'd been silent throughout the firefight, pressed against the stone, her hands over her ears. But now she stood, her face transformed by something Reed couldn't identify. Not fear, something beyond fear, something primal and powerful. "Alara, get down!" Reed hissed. She ignored him. She walked to the edge of their cover, into full view of Christo's men, and for a moment, Reed thought she'd gone mad with terror, thought she was surrendering or giving up. Then she opened her mouth,
and she screamed. The sound that emerged was nothing human. It was the shriek of a mountain lion, the cry of a hawk, the howl of wind through canyon walls, all of it compressed and amplified and focused into one pure note of rage and defiance and grief. It was the scream of a girl who'd been silent for 6 years, who'd swallowed her voice and her truth and her pain, and now was releasing it all at once in a sound that could shatter stone. The effect was instantaneous. Christo's men froze, their hands going to their ears. One of the horses, tied below, reared and screamed in answer, breaking its tether. The other animals spooked, bolting, creating chaos at the base of the path. But more than that, the scream seemed to trigger something in the windmill itself. The old structure, silent for decades, caught the vibration of Alara's voice and amplified it, the wooden frame resonating, the metal blades beginning to turn, not from wind, but from the sheer force of sound waves hitting them. Christo stumbled backward, his hands over his ears, his face twisted in pain. "What the hell?" Alara screamed again, and this time Reed understood. Her father had taught her, had trained her ear to hear the subtlest sounds, to know how sound moved and shaped space. She'd learned to listen with her bones, to feel vibration as much as hear it, and now she was weaponizing it, using her voice as a tool of survival. The scarred man, Tomas, tried to raise his rifle, tried to aim through the disorienting noise. His shot went wild, ricocheting harmlessly off stone. Reed fired his last 2 rifle rounds in quick succession. The first missed, but the second caught Tomas in the leg. The man went down hard, his weapon skittering away. Christo was retreating now, scrambling down the path toward where the horses had been, his 2 remaining men following. But one of them, the youngest, the bandana-wearing man, turned back, raising his pistol with shaking hands, aiming directly at Alara's chest. Reed moved without thinking, putting himself between the gun and the girl. The shot came, a thunderclap in the gathering darkness. Reed felt impact, felt fire blossom in his left shoulder, felt his legs go weak. He fired his pistol once, twice, 3 times. The young man jerked with each impact, his body dancing backward, and then he fell, his bandana slipping away to reveal a face that couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Reed's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, his hand pressed to his shoulder where blood was spreading in a warm, sticky flood. Alara's scream cut off abruptly, and she was there, catching him, supporting him, her small hands trying to staunch the bleeding. Below, Christo and his last man were running, disappearing into the darkness, their footsteps fading. They'd lost. They'd failed. But Reed had paid the price. "I'm all right," Reed tried to say, but the words came out slurred. The world was tilting, graying at the edges. "You need to find Sister Miriam. Get to town." Alara was crying, tears streaming down her face, and her mouth was moving, trying to form words. "No," she managed, the syllable raw and broken. "No, no, no. You can talk," Reed said stupidly, blood loss making him slow. "You found your voice. Don't die," Alara choked out, each word clearly agonizing, muscles that hadn't formed speech in years struggling with the mechanics. "Please, don't die." Reed wanted to promise he wouldn't, wanted to tell her everything would be fine. But he'd lost too much blood, and the darkness was closing in fast, and all he could do was reach up with his good hand and touch her face, feeling the tears and the dirt and the fierce determination of a girl who'd already lost too much. "Brave," he whispered. "So brave." Then the darkness took him, and he knew nothing more. When Reed's eyes opened again, he thought at first he was dead. The ceiling above him was white plaster, not the splintered wood of his ranch house or the open sky of the windmill ruins. Voices murmured nearby, low and urgent. The smell of carbolic and blood filled his nostrils. "Mr. Dalton!" Sister Miriam's face swam into view, lined with exhaustion, but smiling. "Welcome back. You gave us quite a scare." Reed tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his shoulder, sharp and hot. "Alara," he croaked. "Where—" "She's safe. She's here." The nun stepped aside and Alara appeared, her face pale but determined. She wore a clean dress, her hair had been washed and braided, and the wooden cross still hung around her neck. When she saw Reed was awake, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "What happened?" Reed managed. "You collapsed from blood loss," Sister Miriam explained. "Alara somehow got you down from the windmill ruins, don't ask me how, the girl's stronger than she looks, and flagged down a freight wagon on the North Road. They brought you here, to the mission. I've been treating the wound. The bullet passed through, missed the bone and major vessels. You'll heal, God willing, though your left arm will be weak for some time." Reed's fragmented memory supplied images. Alara's scream, Christo fleeing, the young man falling. Christo, his men, did they? Gone. Fled into the territories, from what the sheriff can tell. But it doesn't matter now. Sister Miriam's smile widened. "We have the journals, Mr. Dalton. We have the ledger, and we have something even more powerful." She gestured, and Alara stepped forward. The girl's hands were shaking, but her jaw was set with determination. She took a breath, and when she spoke, the words were halting and raw, but clear. "My name is Alara Tolwyn. I wasn't born mute. I was silenced." Reed felt tears prick his eyes. "You did it. You found your voice. Because of you," Alara said, each word still an effort but getting easier. "You believed me when no one else would." Sister Miriam wiped her own eyes. "The sheriff has the evidence. Carlos's journals detail his suspicions about Marilla, his fear that she married him for his ranch. The ledger shows payments to officials, bribes to keep questions from being asked. And now we have Alara's testimony, her voice." "Marilla?" Reed asked. "Arrested. She's in the town jail awaiting trial. Christo and his men are wanted for attempted murder. The judge who is on her payroll has recused himself, and a circuit judge is coming from the territorial capital." The nun's expression hardened. "Justice is slow, Mr. Dalton, but it's coming." Reed closed his eyes, letting relief wash over him. They'd done it. Against the odds, against violence and corruption, they'd won. A rancher, a nun, and a girl who'd refused to stay silent had brought down a murderer. "Rest now," Sister Miriam said gently. "Both of you have earned it." But Alara didn't move. She sat beside Reed's bed, her small hand finding his, holding tight. And when he looked at her, he saw not a victim, not a broken child, but a survivor. Someone who'd walked through fire and emerged tempered like steel. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Thank you," Reed replied, "for reminding me what's worth fighting for." Outside, the desert night was falling, stars emerging in the vast darkness above. Somewhere out there, Christo was running, and Marilla sat in a cell contemplating her fall. But here, in this small room in a mission on the edge of nowhere, two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances rested together, healing and beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be better than today. But peace, Reed had learned long ago, was a luxury the frontier rarely granted for long. He'd been recovering at the mission for 3 days, his shoulder healing slowly under Sister Miriam's careful tending, when the first whisper of trouble reached them. A freight hauler passing through mentioned seeing riders in the hills west of town, men who didn't belong to any of the local ranches, asking questions about a rancher named Dalton and a girl who couldn't speak. "Christo," Reed said immediately, pushing himself up from the cot despite the protest of his injured shoulder. "He's still out there, and he's gathering men." Sister Miriam's face tightened with worry. "The sheriff knows. He's increased patrols around town, but his jurisdiction only extends so far. Once Christo crosses into the territories, there's nothing the law can do." "He won't cross into the territories," Reed said grimly. "Not yet. He's got unfinished business here." Alara, who'd been sitting in the corner practicing her words with the patience of someone relearning a lost language, looked up sharply. Her voice, though still halting and rough from disuse, carried more strength each day. "He wants me to silence me before trial." Reed met her eyes across the small room. "He's not getting anywhere near you." "Mr. Dalton, you can barely lift your left arm," Sister Miriam protested. "You're in no condition to fight." "Then I better make sure it doesn't come to fighting."
Reed stood, testing his balance. The room swayed slightly, but he pushed through the dizziness. We need help, real help. Someone who knows these hills, who can track Christo and his men before they make their move. And where do you propose we find such a person? The nun asked. Reed was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then a name surfaced from memory, a man he'd known years ago during his cavalry days. Silas Crow. He used to scout for the army, best tracker I ever knew.
Last I heard, he'd gone hermit up in the high country north of here. The Crow? Sister Miriam's eyebrows rose. That old ghost. I've heard stories about him, that he can move through rock and air, that he talks to ravens, that he once tracked a man 300 miles through a blizzard just to return a stolen Bible. Most of that's nonsense, Reed said, but the tracking part is true. If anyone can find Christo before Christo finds us, it's Silas. Ilara stood, her small frame radiating determination. I'll go with you. Absolutely not, Reed said immediately. You'll stay here where it's safe. Her eyes flashed with something fierce. Nowhere is safe. Not while Christo lives. And you need someone to watch your back. She struggled with the words, frustration clear on her face, but pushed through. You saved me. Now I save you. Reed wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the mission and keep her away from danger, but he recognized the look on her face. It was the same stubborn determination he'd seen in the mirror plenty of times, the set of jaw that said no argument would change her mind. She has a point, Sister Miriam said quietly, and she knows these lands better than you do, Mr. Dalton. She grew up here, riding with her father through every canyon and valley. Reed looked between the two of them, outnumbered and knowing it. Fine. But we do this smart. We find Silas, we make a plan, and we don't take any damn fool risks. Agreed? Ilara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. It was the first time Reed had seen her smile, and despite everything, it warmed something in his chest. They left before dawn the next morning. Reed on Copper and Ilara on the gentle mare Sister Miriam had procured for her. The nun had packed them supplies, pressed a small pistol into Ilara's hands with stern instructions on when and how to use it, and made them both promise to return safely. God watches over fools and children, Sister Miriam said as they prepared to ride out, and I'm not entirely sure which category you fall into, Mr. Dalton. Probably both, Reed admitted, checking his rifle one more time. His shoulder still ached, but Sister Miriam had fashioned a sling that took some of the weight off. He wouldn't be quick on the draw, but he could shoot if needed. They rode north into country that grew progressively wilder, the cultivated valleys giving way to rocky highlands where pine and juniper clung to steep slopes. The air grew cooler, cleaner, carrying the scent of sage and cedar. Ilara rode beside him in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, not the enforced muteness of survival, but the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need constant words. By midday, they'd reached the foothills of what locals called the Sangre de Cristo Range, though the mountains here were more like rugged hills than true peaks. Reed guided them toward a canyon he remembered from years past, where Silas had once maintained a camp. How will we find him? Ilara asked, the words coming easier now with practice. We won't, Reed said. He'll find us. Silas knows when someone's in his territory before they know it themselves. As if summoned by the words, a voice called out from the rocks above. Reed Dalton! Thought you were dead! Reed reined Copper to a stop, scanning the slopes. Still kicking, Silas. You going to show yourself or just talk to us from the shadows? A figure emerged from behind a jumble of boulders, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. Silas Crow was older than Reed remembered, maybe 60 now, his long hair gone completely gray, his face weathered like old leather. But his eyes were sharp as a hawk's, missing nothing, and the rifle he carried looked well-maintained and ready. You brought a child, Silas observed, his gaze settling on Ilara. And you're hurt. Shoulder wound, maybe 3, 4 days old. Someone's hunting you. How'd you... Reed started, then shook his head. Never mind. Yes, someone's hunting us. Man named Christo Madden and whoever he's rounded up. We need your help tracking them before they find us. Silas descended from the rocks with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, moving close enough to study them both properly. His eyes lingered on Alara, taking in her defensive posture, the way she kept one hand near the pistol at her belt, the fierce intelligence in her gaze. "This the girl everyone's talking about?" Silas asked. "The one who couldn't speak and then could?" Alara met his gaze steadily. "I am Alara, and I can speak now." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred survivor. "Good. This country doesn't have much use for the silent. You know how to shoot that pistol?" "Sister Miriam, taught me." "Then you'll do." Silas turned to Reed. "How many men is this Christo traveling with?" "At least 3, maybe more by now. He's got money from his boss, can hire guns." "And what do you want from me? Tracking, ambush, or just warning when they get close?" Reed hesitated, the weight of what he was asking settling on his shoulders. "I want to end this. Christo won't stop, won't give up, not while Ilar is alive to testify. We can run, but he'll just keep coming, so I need you to help us turn the tables, help us hunt the hunters." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "I gave up killing when I left the army, told myself I'd seen enough blood, taken enough lives." "I'm not asking you to kill anyone, Raisa," Reed said. "Just help us find them, help us set a trap. Maybe we can take them alive, bring them in for justice." "And if that's not possible?" Reed's jaw tightened. "Then we do what needs doing to protect an innocent girl." Silas looked between them again, calculation in his gaze. Finally, he nodded once. "All right, but we do this my way. No rushing in, no heroics. We plan, we prepare, and we strike only when the odds are in our favor. Agreed?" "Agreed," Reed said, feeling relief wash through him. "Good. Then let's get to work." "Your Christo and his men were at Miller's Pass yesterday evening, asking the settlers there about a rancher and a girl. They're working their way north, probably figure you're headed this direction. Smart money says they'll hit the mission next." Reed's blood ran cold. "Sister Miriam, relax. Sister's tougher than she looks, and she's got half the town ready to defend that mission if needed. Your Christo might be mean, but he's not stupid enough to attack a church with witnesses around." Silas gestured toward his camp. "Come on, we need to talk strategy, and you need to rest that shoulder before it opens up again." Silas's camp was a marvel of wilderness living, a small lean-to built into a rock overhang, a fire pit designed to disperse smoke so it couldn't be seen from a distance, and supplies stored in carefully sealed containers to keep out animals. He had maps too, detailed sketches of the surrounding territory drawn from memory, marking water sources, game trails, and what he called pinch points, places where the terrain forced travelers into predictable paths. They spent the afternoon planning, with Silas pointing out the likely routes Christo would take. If he's smart, he'll avoid the main trails. Too much chance of running into the law. But that limits his options. There's really only 3 ways through this country without being seen: the Arroyo Seco, the Devil's Staircase, or the old mining road through Whiskey Canyon. "Which would you take?" Reed asked. "The mining road. It's longer but safer, harder to ambush because you can see trouble coming from a distance." Silas tapped the map. "But Christo doesn't know this country like we do. If we're lucky, he'll take the Devil's Staircase. It looks like the fastest route, but it's a natural kill box. Narrow passage with high walls on both sides." Alara, who'd been listening intently, leaned forward. "I know. That place. Papa took me through there once. Said it was dangerous. Called it La Trampa del Diablo, the devil's trap." "Your father was a smart man," Silas said. "It is a trap, if you know how to use it." Reed studied the map, his tactical training from the cavalry coming back despite the years. "We'd need to control both ends, and we'd need to be sure Christo actually goes that way." "That's where I come in," Silas said. "I can leave signs, false trails, make the other routes look watched or dangerous, funnel him toward the staircase without him knowing he's being herded. And once he's in the trap, then we have options. Could try talking him into surrender. Christo's mean, but he's not suicidal. More likely, we'll need to convince him that his best chance of survival is giving up." "How do we do that?"
Alara asked. Silas's smile was thin and dangerous. We make him think he's surrounded by more men than he is. We use the canyon walls to amplify sound, make it seem like there's rifles on every ridge. We position ourselves so we can control the field of fire, and we make sure he knows that the girl he's hunting is the bait in a trap, not the prize. Reed didn't like the sound of using Alara as bait, but he kept his mouth shut. They'd figure out the details later, once they knew for sure Christo was coming. They spent the night at Silas's camp, taking turns on watch, despite the older scout's assurance that no one could approach without his knowledge. Reed's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, making sleep fitful and shallow. He woke before dawn to find Alara already up, sitting by the banked fire, staring into the coals. "Can't sleep?" Reed asked quietly. She shook her head. "Too many thoughts. Too many fears." Reed moved to sit beside her, mindful of his shoulder. "You don't have to do this, you know. We could still send you somewhere safe, far from here, until this is over." "And where would that be?" Alara asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Christo has money, connections. He would find me, eventually. And I am tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid." Reed understood that feeling in his bones. "Your father would be proud of you. You know that, right?" Tears glistened in her eyes. "I hope so. I hope he knows that I finally found my voice, that I will tell the truth about what happened." "He knows," Reed said with certainty. "Wherever he is, he knows." Silas emerged from his lean-to as the first light began to paint the eastern sky. "Time to move. I need to get ahead of Christo's group, start laying the false trails. You two will hole up at the northern end of the Devil's Staircase, where you can cover the exit. I'll push them through to you." "How long will it take?" Reed asked. "If they move at their current pace, they'll reach the staircase by tomorrow afternoon. That gives us today to prepare." Silas began packing supplies with practiced efficiency. "Reed, you remember how to set a deadfall?" "Been a while, but yes." "Good. You'll want at least 2, maybe 3, positioned where they'll make Christo think twice about advancing. And tripwires, nothing that'll kill, just enough to make noise, slow them down, make them nervous." Silas turned to Alara. "You know plants? Which ones are safe? Which ones aren't?" She nodded, confused. "There's a plant grows in the high country. Locals call it locoweed. Animals eat it, they go crazy, stagger around, act spooked and wild. Horses especially. You find me some of that? We'll spread it along the trail Christo's men will use to picket their horses. Come nightfall, those animals will be raising hell, keeping everyone awake and jumpy." A slow smile spread across Alara's face. "Smart. That's how you win a war without firing a shot," Silas said. "Make the enemy exhausted, scared, and off balance. By the time we confront them, they'll be ready to give up." They split up after breakfast, Silas heading south to begin his manipulation of Christo's route, while Reed and Alara rode north toward the Devil's Staircase. The canyon was everything Alara had described. A narrow cleft in the rock barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with walls that rose sheer for 60 feet on either side. The floor was littered with stones that had calved off the walls over centuries, creating natural obstacles and cover. Reed spent the day setting his traps, using rope and leverage and carefully balanced rocks to create deadfalls that could be triggered from a distance. Alara helped, her small hands proving nimble at tying knots and threading wire. She also ranged further into the surrounding hills, returning with bundles of plants that Silas had described, spreading them along the trail approaches. As the sun began to set, they climbed to a ledge about 30 feet up the northern wall of the canyon, accessible only by a narrow chimney crack that required scrambling and handholds. From here, they could see the entire length of the staircase stretching away to the south, and they had clear fields of fire if shooting became necessary. "Now we wait," Reed said, settling in with his rifle across his knees. Alara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Reed?" "Yeah. Thank you for everything, for buying my freedom, for believing me, for fighting for me."
Reed felt his throat tighten. You don't need to thank me. You're the one who saved yourself, Elara. I just gave you the chance. Still, she said softly, no one else did. They sat in silence as stars began to emerge overhead, millions of pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. The desert night was cool and clear, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Reed found himself thinking about Sarah, about the daughter who never got to grow up, and realized that somewhere along the way, this fierce, broken, healing girl had filled a space in his heart he'd thought permanently empty. When this is over, Reed said quietly, when Christo's dealt with and Marilla's trial is done, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Elara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but certain. I want to stay with you, if you'll have me. Reed felt something crack open in his chest. Elara, I'm just a rancher. I don't know anything about raising kids, about being a father. You know how to be kind, she interrupted. How to be brave. How to fight for what's right. That's enough. Reed couldn't speak for a moment, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Finally, he managed, then you'll stay, for as long as you want. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She leaned against him, her head resting on his good shoulder, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Reed felt something like hope for the future. They took turns sleeping that night, one always on watch. When dawn broke, Silas appeared below like a ghost, moving silently through the canyon and climbing up to their ledge with barely a sound. They're coming, he said without preamble. 6 men total, including Christo. They're tired, jumpy, been hearing noises all night from their camp, horses acting up. They know something's wrong, but they can't figure out what. They'll be here within the hour. 6 men, Reed repeated, his stomach nodding. That's twice what you said before. Christo recruited along the way, but that's good for us. More men means more confusion, more chance someone will break and run when things get hot. What's the plan? Reed asked. Silas pulled out a small horn made from a ram's horn, carved with intricate designs. I'll take position on the south rim. When they enter the canyon, I'll blow this. The acoustics in here will make it sound like there's men on every ridge. You two start shooting, not at them, at the rocks around them, over their heads. Make them think they're under fire from multiple positions. I'll do the same from my side. If we're lucky, they'll panic, try to retreat, and we can pick them off as they funnel back out. And if they don't panic? Elara asked. Then we actually have to shoot them, Silas said bluntly. You ready for that, girl? Elara's hand moved to the pistol at her belt. I won't let Christo hurt anyone else. That's the spirit. Silas checked his rifle, then started back down the chimney crack. Remember, first shots are warnings. Give them a chance to surrender. But if they push it, if they try to advance or hurt someone, you put them down. No hesitation, no mercy. Understood? Understood, Reed said. Silas vanished into the shadows, and Reed and Elara settled in to wait. The sun climbed higher, heat beginning to build in the canyon. Reed's mouth was dry, his heart hammering. This was it. The moment where everything they'd fought for would either succeed or end in blood and failure. Reed? Elara's voice was barely a whisper. Yeah? I'm scared. Me too, Reed admitted. But we're going to be okay. We're together. We've got Silas, and we've got right on our side. That counts for something. She nodded, gripping her pistol tighter. Then they heard it, the sound of horses, the low murmur of men's voices echoing off stone. Christo and his gang were entering the Devil's Staircase. Reed raised his rifle, sighting down the canyon. 6 riders came into view, picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. Christo rode in front, his face hard and suspicious, clearly aware they were in vulnerable territory. Behind him came the scarred Tomas, limping but mounted, and 4 others Reed didn't recognize. Hard men with the look of hired guns, men who killed for money and asked no questions. They were 100 yards in when Silas's horn sounded. The note was low and mournful, but the canyon walls grabbed it and threw it back, amplifying and distorting it until it sounded like a dozen horns, like an army signaling attack. The effect on Christo's group was immediate. The horses shied. The men's heads whipped around, trying to identify the source. Reed fired, his bullet striking rock 3 feet to Christo's left, sending up a spray of stone chips. A heartbeat later, Silas fired from the opposite side. His shot equally precise, equally intimidating. "Ambush!" One of Christo's men yelled, his voice cracking with panic. More shots rang out, Reed and Silas working in rhythm, placing bullets close but not lethal, creating the impression of overwhelming firepower from multiple positions. Alara fired her pistol once, twice, the shots wild but adding to the chaos. Christo's men broke. 2 of them wheeled their horses immediately, spurring back toward the southern entrance. Another fired blindly at the canyon walls, his shots ricocheting uselessly. Tomas tried to control his spooked horse, lost his seat, and hit the ground hard. But Christo himself didn't run. His eyes were scanning the ridges, counting muzzle flashes, calculating. "It's a trick," he shouted. "There's only 2, maybe 3 of them. Stand and fight, damn you!" One of the hired guns, braver or stupider than the others, dismounted and took cover behind a boulder, returning fire with methodical precision. His bullet struck the rock near Reed's position, close enough to send chips stinging against his face. "Christo!" Reed called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. "It's over! The law's coming! Marilla's in custody and you're trapped. Throw down your weapons and you'll live to see trial." Christo's answering laugh was harsh. "You think I'm afraid of trial, Dalton? I'm a dead man already if I go back. Marilla will have me killed before I can testify. My only chance is to finish this. Kill the girl. Kill you. Disappear into Mexico." He raised his rifle, and with horror, Reed realized Christo had spotted their position. The rifle swung toward the ledge, toward Alara, and Christo's finger tightened on the trigger. Reed moved without thinking, throwing himself in front of Alara just as Christo fired. The bullet meant for her struck him instead, catching him high in the chest, just below the collarbone. The impact spun him around, sent him sprawling, his rifle clattering away across the stone ledge. "Reed!" Alara's scream was raw, primal, the same soul-deep sound she'd made at the windmill. But this time, there was no calculation in it, no weaponizing, just pure anguish. Through the haze of pain, Reed saw her raise her pistol, saw her aim with hands that no longer shook, saw her fire once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. The first shot missed, the second caught Christo in the shoulder, spinning him. The third struck him square in the chest, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The gunfire ceased abruptly, the canyon falling silent except for the echo of that final shot rolling away into the distance. Christo's remaining men, those who hadn't already fled, raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with shock. Silas appeared from his position, rifle trained on the surrendering men, his voice sharp with command. "On your bellies, hands behind your heads. Move slow or I'll drop you where you stand." But Reed barely registered any of it. His vision was graying, his chest on fire, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He'd been shot before, knew what it meant when you started tasting blood. The bullet had found something vital, and he was dying. Alara was beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no," she kept saying, the words clearer now, stronger. "You can't die. You can't leave me. Please, Reed, please." "Alara," Reed managed, his voice barely a whisper. "You have to testify. Promise me. You'll tell the truth." "I promise," she sobbed. "I'll tell everything. But you have to stay. You have to live. You promised we'd figure things out. Together." Reed tried to smile, tried to tell her it would be okay, that she was strong enough to survive whatever came next. But the darkness was closing in fast, and the last thing he saw before the world went black was her face above him, fierce and tearful and alive, so beautifully, courageously alive. He didn't hear Silas calling for help, didn't feel himself being carried down from the ledge. Didn't know that Sister Miriam would ride through the night with the town doctor, that they'd work through dawn to extract the bullet and stitch the torn flesh. Didn't know he'd lie in fever dreams for 3 days, hovering between life and death while Alara sat vigil beside his bed, refusing to leave, refusing to let him go. All he knew was darkness and pain
and somewhere far away, a girl's voice calling him back from the edge, demanding he stay, commanding him to live. And somehow, impossibly, against all odds and logic, he did. When Reed finally clawed his way back to consciousness, the world came to him in fragments. The smell of carbolic and sage, the rough texture of wool blankets against his skin, the steady throb of pain in his chest that at least meant he was still alive. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on whitewashed ceiling beams that he recognized as belonging to the mission infirmary. Sunlight streamed through a window, dust motes dancing in the golden light, and beside his bed sat Ilara, her head pillowed on her arms where they rested on the mattress, fast asleep. She looked younger in sleep, the hard edges of survival softened, and Reed could see traces of the child she should have been allowed to be, peaceful, unburdened, safe. Her hand was extended toward his, their fingers barely touching, as if even in sleep she needed to maintain that connection, to assure herself he was still there. Reed shifted slightly, and the movement sent a lance of fire through his chest that made him gasp. The sound woke Ilara instantly, her head snapping up, her eyes wide and frightened until they focused on his face. Then her expression transformed, relief and joy flooding through tears that came too fast to stop. "You're awake," she breathed, and her voice was stronger now, clearer, though still carrying the roughness of muscles relearning their purpose. "Reed, you're awake. I thought... The doctor said... We almost lost you twice." "How long?" Reed managed, his throat desert dry. 5 days. 5 days of fever and... She couldn't finish, just gripped his hand tighter, as if she could anchor him to life through sheer force of will. Sister Miriam appeared in the doorway, drawn by their voices, and her weathered face broke into a smile of profound relief. "Mr. Dalton, welcome back to the world of the living. You gave us quite a scare. Dr. Morrison said you had no business surviving that wound, that the bullet had nicked your lung and you'd lost too much blood.
But here you are, stubborn as ever." "Christo?" Reed asked, the name scraping past his damaged throat. "Dead," Sister Miriam said simply. Ilara's shot was true. The others surrendered to Silas and were brought in to face justice. They're singing like canaries, Mr. Dalton, telling the law everything they know about Marilla's operations, about the murders, about the bribes. The circuit judge arrived 2 days ago, and the trial begins tomorrow. Reed's eyes found Ilara's. "You ready for that?" She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I've been practicing, with Sister Miriam, with Silas, with anyone who'll listen. My voice is stronger now. I can tell them. I can tell everyone what she did to Papa, what she tried to do to me. She'll try to discredit you," Reed warned. "Her lawyers will say you're confused, traumatized, making up stories. Let them try," Ilara said fiercely. "I have Papa's journals. I have the ledger. I have the testimony of Christo's men. And I have something she can never take away again. My voice. My truth." Sister Miriam moved to check Reed's bandages, her hands gentle but professional. "The town is with her, Mr. Dalton. Word has spread about what happened, how you bought her freedom, how you protected her, how she found her voice to speak truth to power. People are calling it a miracle. Some are calling it justice. Either way, Marilla's influence has crumbled. The men she bribed are either arrested or have fled, and the honest people of Sierra Luce are finally ready to listen." Reed closed his eyes, letting relief wash over him. They'd done it. Against all odds, against violence and corruption, and the weight of the law twisted to serve the powerful, they'd won. Over the next day, as Reed's strength gradually returned, he learned the full story of what had happened after he'd fallen. Silas had taken command in the canyon, securing Christo's men and sending riders for help. The freight wagon that brought Reed to the mission had driven through the night, and Dr. Morrison had worked for 7 hours straight to extract the bullet and repair the damage to Reed's lung. Ilara had refused to leave his side through it all, maintaining her vigil even when Sister Miriam tried to make her rest. "She saved your life," the nun told him quietly. "Not just by shooting Christo, but by refusing to let you go. There were times when your breathing stopped, when we thought you'd slipped away, and she would talk to you, command you to come back. And somehow, you did." On the morning of the trial, Reed insisted on attending despite Dr. Morrison's protests. Sister Miriam and Silas helped him dress, fashioning a sling for his arm and wrapping his chest in tight bandages to support his damaged lung. The pain was considerable, but Reed had survived worse, and there was no way in hell he was going to let Alara face that courtroom alone. The courthouse was packed, every seat filled and people standing 3 deep in the back. Reed recognized faces from town, shopkeepers and ranchers, miners and housewives, all come to witness what was being called the trial of the decade. At the front, in a wooden chair flanked by 2 deputies, sat Doña Marila Ventano, dressed in her perpetual black, her face a mask of cold contempt. Her eyes found Reed and Alara as they entered, and for just a moment that mask slipped, revealing the hatred beneath. But then it was back, smooth and impenetrable, as her lawyer leaned close to whisper strategy. The circuit judge, a stern man named Blackwood with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, called the court to order. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Carlos Ventano's journals, detailing his growing suspicion of his new wife, his fear that she'd married him for his ranch. The ledger, showing payments to officials to ensure questions weren't asked after his convenient death. Testimony from Christo's captured men, who described in damning detail how Marilla had ordered them to terrorize Alara, to keep her silent, to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Through it all, Marilla sat unmoved, occasionally whispering to her lawyer, her face betraying nothing. She was fighting to the bitter end, Reed realized, clinging to the strategy that had served her for years: deny everything, discredit the accusers, trust in the power of money and influence to corrupt justice. Then Alara was called to the stand. Reed watched her stand, watched her smooth down the simple blue dress Sister Miriam had made for her, watched her cross to the witness chair with her head held high. She was terrified. He could see it in the tension of her shoulders, in the way her hands gripped the chair arms, but she didn't falter. Judge Blackwood looked at her kindly. "Young lady, please state your name for the court." Alara took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the hushed courtroom with bell-like clarity. "My name is Alara Rosa Tolwyn. I am 14 years old, and I am the daughter of Carlos Ventano." "Miss Tolwyn," the prosecutor began gently, "this court has heard testimony that for 6 years you were believed to be deaf and mute. Can you explain why?" Alara's eyes moved to Marilla, holding her gaze steadily. "I wasn't born deaf or mute. I could hear and speak perfectly until my father died. But after his death, after I saw what really happened, I knew that speaking the truth would get me killed. So I stopped speaking. I pretended to be deaf so Doña Marilla would think I was no threat." "And what did you see, Miss Tolwyn? What truth were you afraid to speak?" The courtroom held its breath. Alara's hands trembled, but her voice stayed strong. "I saw Marilla drug my father's horse. I was in the barn that morning. She didn't know I was there. She put something in the horse's feed, something that made him wild and uncontrollable. Then she sent Papa out riding, knowing the horse would bolt, knowing Papa would be thrown. And when he came back with his neck broken, she cried and played the grieving widow while stealing everything he'd built." Marilla's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! This is nothing but the fantasy of a traumatized child with no understanding of—" "The child seems remarkably articulate to me," Judge Blackwood interrupted dryly. "Objection overruled. Continue, Miss Tolwyn." "She kept me as a prisoner," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength as the words poured out after years of enforced silence. "She told everyone I was deaf, so my testimony would be worthless. She worked me like a servant, beat me when I wasn't obedient enough, and threatened to have me killed if I ever tried to speak. For 6 years I lived in silence, trapped in my own home, watching her enjoy everything my father had built while she destroyed his memory and his legacy." "And how did you escape this situation?" the prosecutor asked. "Reed Dalton bought my freedom." Alara's eyes found Reed in the audience, and a small smile touched her lips. "Marilla tried to sell me at auction, thinking she could get rid of me and make it look legal. But Reed saw through the deception. He knew I could hear, knew I was pretending. He paid everything he had to take me away from her, and then he protected me when she sent her men to take me back or kill me. He nearly died protecting me. Twice." The prosecutor let that sink in, let the courtroom digest the image of a lonely rancher spending his last dollar to save a girl everyone else had written off. Then he asked, "Miss Tolwyn, Why should this court believe your testimony? You admit you've been lying for 6 years. How do we know you're telling the truth now?"
Alara's expression hardened. Because lying was survival. Truth was death. I did what I had to do to stay alive long enough to see this day. But now I'm here, in a court of law, before honest witnesses, and I swear on my father's grave that everything I've said is the truth. Doña Marila murdered my father for his ranch, kept me prisoner to prevent me from testifying, and tried to have me killed when I finally escaped. And if this court won't give me justice, then there is no justice in this territory. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Blackwood gavelled for order, but even he looked moved by Alara's testimony. Marilla's lawyer stood to cross-examine, his questions pointed and aggressive, trying to poke holes in her story, trying to suggest she'd been coached or manipulated. But Alara held firm, answering each question with calm precision, never wavering, never breaking.
Finally, frustrated and sensing he was losing the room, the lawyer turned to his final attack. "Miss Tolwyn, isn't it true that you killed Christo Madden in cold blood, that you shot an unarmed man?" "No," Alara said firmly. "Christo was armed and had just shot Reed trying to kill him. I fired in defense of another person's life. That's not murder. That's protection." "You're 14 years old. How did you learn to shoot well enough to kill a man with 3 shots?" "Sister Miriam taught me the basics. Fear and necessity taught me the rest." Alara's voice was cold now, harder than any 14-year-old should be. "I learned that if you want to survive in this world, if you want to protect the people you love, you have to be willing to fight. And when I saw Christo about to kill Reed, the man who'd risked everything to save me, I fought." The lawyer had no response to that. He sat down, and the defense rested its case without calling Marilla to testify. A strategic decision, Reed suspected, because putting her on the stand would only give the prosecution another chance to expose her lies. Judge Blackwood deliberated for less than an hour before returning to the courtroom. His verdict was swift and comprehensive. In the matter of the territory versus Marilla Ventano, this court finds the defendant guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of false imprisonment, guilty of corruption of public officials, and guilty of fraud. The evidence is overwhelming, the testimony compelling, and the defendant's actions speak to a pattern of calculated cruelty that this court cannot and will not tolerate. Marilla's face drained of color, her mask finally cracking to reveal the fear beneath. "You can't. This is a travesty. I demand an appeal." "You'll have your opportunity to appeal," Judge Blackwood said coldly, "from a territorial prison where you'll serve a sentence of no less than 20 years. Deputies, remove the prisoner." As the deputies hauled Marilla from the courtroom, she twisted back to stare at Alara with pure venom. "You little bitch," she hissed. "You've destroyed everything. You should have stayed silent. You should have died with your father." "But I didn't," Alara said quietly, her voice cutting through Marilla's rage like a knife. "I lived. I found my voice, and I made sure everyone knows what you are, a murderer and a thief who will die in a cell, forgotten and despised." Marilla screamed then, a sound of impotent rage and thwarted power, but the deputies dragged her away and the heavy doors swung shut, cutting off her cries. The courtroom erupted in applause, people rising to their feet, and Reed saw tears on many faces, tears of relief, of vindication, of justice finally served. Alara stood in the witness box, looking small and young and utterly exhausted, and Reed pushed through the crowd to reach her. She saw him coming and stumbled down from the stand, and they met in the middle of the courtroom, Reed pulling her into an embrace despite the protest of his healing wounds. "You did it," he said hoarsely. "You were magnificent." "We did it," she corrected, her voice muffled against his chest. "Together." The days that followed were a blur of lawyers and paperwork and legal proceedings. Carlos Ventano's will was read, revealing that he'd left everything to his daughter, with provisions that if anything happened to him under suspicious circumstances, an independent investigation should be conducted. Marilla had suppressed the will, but now it was honored. The ranch, the cattle, the water rights, all of it passed to Alara, making her one of the wealthiest young women in the territory. "I don't want it," she told Reed as they stood on the porch of her father's house, her house now, looking out over land that stretched to the horizon. "Not the ranch, not the money, not any of it. It's all tainted with blood and lies. Your father built this place with honest work, Reed said gently. What Marilla did doesn't change that. And you could do a lot of good with this land, with these resources. Like what? Reed thought for a moment, an idea forming. The mission is always short on funds. Sister Miriam's been talking for years about starting a school, a real school where kids from the ranches and mining camps could learn to read and write. You could fund that. You could turn your father's legacy into something that helps people. Elara's eyes lit up. A school? Yes. Papa always said education was the most valuable thing a person could have. She turned to Reed, her expression serious. But I still want to come live with you, at your ranch. This place, it has too many ghosts. I need somewhere that feels like home. My place is half the size of this and makes about 1/10 of the profit, Reed warned, but he was smiling. I don't care about profit. I care about being somewhere I feel safe, somewhere with someone who sees me as more than property or a problem. She paused, then added quietly, somewhere with family. Reed's throat tightened. Family, yeah, I'd like that too. The legal process of making it official took another month. Reed formally adopted Elara, becoming her legal guardian and father in the eyes of the law. The Ventano Ranch was sold to a consortium of local ranchers who'd been suffering under Marilla's water monopoly, with the proceeds going into a trust that would fund the mission school Sister Miriam had dreamed of for so long. Elara kept only a few things from her father's house, his journals, some photographs, and a silver flute he'd used to play for her when she was small. The school opened in early November, housed in a new building constructed on mission land, with Sister Miriam as headmistress and 3 teachers hired from back east. Elara attended as the first student, finally getting the education her father had wanted for her. But she also taught, working with the younger children, helping them learn to read and write, sharing the gift of words with kids who'd grown up believing education was only for rich folks in cities. Reed watched her transform over the following months, watched her grow into herself like a plant finally getting enough water and sunlight. Her voice grew stronger, more confident, until the day came when Reed couldn't remember what she'd sounded like when she was silent. She laughed now, a sound that had been absent for so long, and argued with him about everything from politics to proper fence-mending technique. She made friends at school, girls her own age who looked up to her courage, and boys who were equal parts intimidated and intrigued by her fierce intelligence. Silas became a regular visitor to the ranch, ostensibly to check fences or track the occasional predator threatening the cattle, but Reed suspected the old scout just enjoyed the company after years of solitude. He taught Elara tracking, wilderness survival, and marksmanship, and he told stories about his days scouting for the cavalry that had her riveted. You gave her something precious, Silas told Reed one evening as they sat on the porch watching Elara practice her shooting at targets set up in the pasture. Not just safety, not just a home. You gave her the chance to be who she was always meant to be. She did that herself, Reed said. I just provided the opportunity. Don't sell yourself short. Most men would have walked past that auction without a second glance. You saw what others missed, a person worth saving. That takes a special kind of courage. Reed watched Elara fire, watched her adjust her stance based on where the shot hit, watched her fierce concentration. She saved me as much as I saved her. Maybe more. After Sarah died, after my daughter, I thought I was done. Thought I'd just work the ranch until I couldn't anymore and then die alone. But Elara reminded me that life goes on, that there's still good to be done in the world. On a warm spring afternoon nearly a year after the trial, Reed and Elara sat beneath the old cottonwood trees that shaded the ranch house, watching clouds build over the mountains. Elara was reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice clear and expressive, stumbling only occasionally over the more archaic language. She'd become a voracious reader, making up for the years when reading was the only safe escape from her prison. Reed? She said, setting the book aside. I've been thinking. Dangerous pastime, Reed teased. She smiled but didn't rise to the bait. I want to write about what happened. About Papa, about Marilla, about everything. Sister Miriam says stories have power, that by sharing our experiences, we help others who might be suffering in silence. You think you're ready for that? Reed asked gently. It'll mean reliving some hard memories.
I know, but I also know that somewhere out there might be another girl like me, trapped, silent, desperate. If my story can help her find her voice, can show her that escape is possible and justice can be real, then it's worth the pain of remembering. Reed felt a surge of pride so strong it almost hurt. Then you should write it. I'll help however I can. Will you tell me about Sarah? Ilara asked softly. About your daughter? You've never talked about them much, but I'd like to know. They're part of your story, part of what made you who you are. Reed was quiet for a long time, feeling the old grief like a familiar ache.
But somehow, with Ilara beside him, it didn't hurt quite as much as it used to. Her name was going to be Elizabeth, he said finally. We'd picked it out months before, so sure we'd have a daughter. Sarah used to sing to her, even before she was born. And when the time came, when things went wrong, he paused, swallowing hard. Sarah held her for those 43 minutes, and she was so tiny, so perfect. And then she was gone, and Sarah was gone, and I was alone. Ilara's hand found his, squeezing tight. You're not alone anymore. No, Reed agreed, squeezing back. I'm not. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the clouds drift and reform, watching the cattle graze in the distance, watching the windmill turn in the gentle breeze. The ranch was small by most standards, the profits modest, the work hard and unending. But it was home, filled with laughter and arguments and the ordinary miracles of daily life. It was enough, more than enough. As summer arrived and the school year ended, Ilara organized a celebration at the mission, a gathering to honor the students' progress and to thank the community for supporting the school. The mission courtyard was decorated with paper lanterns and bunting, tables groaning under potluck dishes contributed by dozens of families. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed, and Sister Miriam moved through the crowd with a smile that spoke of dreams fulfilled. When it came time for speeches, Ilara stood before the assembled crowd, her voice strong and clear, as she talked about the importance of education, of speaking truth, of never giving up hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Reed watched from the back, his chest swelling with pride that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. The choice to save her, the choice to fight for her, the choice to build a family from the broken pieces of two shattered lives. After her speech, as the celebration continued around them, a young girl approached Ilara shyly. She couldn't have been more than 7, her dress worn but clean, her eyes huge in a thin face. "Miss Ilara?" she whispered. "Is it true you couldn't talk for a long time?" Ilara knelt to the girl's level. "Yes, it's true." "Why not?" "Because I was afraid. Because speaking up felt dangerous." The little girl bit her lip. "Sometimes I'm afraid too. My papa drinks and gets angry, and Mama says we mustn't tell anyone or it'll make things worse." Ilara's expression softened with understanding. She took the girl's small hands in hers. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Clara, listen to me. Being afraid is okay. But staying silent when someone is hurting you or your mama isn't okay. There are people who can help, Sister Miriam, the sheriff, teachers at the school. You don't have to carry that fear alone." "But what if no one believes me?" "Then you keep talking until someone does." I know it's scary. I know it feels impossible. But I promise you, finding your voice, speaking your truth, it's the most powerful thing you can do. Will you try? Clara nodded slowly, tears tracking down her cheeks. Ilara pulled her into a hug, and Reed saw Sister Miriam moving discreetly closer, having overheard the exchange, already preparing to intervene in a situation that might have festered in silence for years. That was when Reed truly understood the ripple effect of their story. They hadn't just saved one girl. They'd created a precedent, shown a community that silence protected abusers and speaking up protected victims. They demonstrated that justice was possible, that the powerful could be held accountable, that even the smallest voice could change the world if it refused to be silenced. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, casting warm circles of light across the mission courtyard, Reed found himself standing beside Silas and Sister Miriam, watching Ilara teach a group of children a singing game her father had taught her long ago. "You did good, Dalton," Silas said quietly. "Real good." "We all did," Reed replied. "Couldn't have done it alone." "That's the truth of it," Sister Miriam agreed. "One person standing against injustice is brave. Many people standing together is unstoppable. She paused, then added, You know, I've been thinking about expanding the school. There are mining camps and ranches even further out that have children who need education. We'd need more teachers, more resources. And you're wondering if a certain wealthy young lady might be willing to fund it, Reed finished with a smile. The thought had crossed my mind. Ask her yourself. But I suspect you already know the answer. As if summoned, Alara broke away from the children and came running over, breathless and laughing. Reed, Sister Miriam, come dance. They're playing Papa's favorite song. Reed let himself be pulled into the crowd, let Alara spin him around despite his protests that his dancing days were behind him, let himself be part of this community they'd fought so hard to protect. Around them, people clapped and sang, children laughed and played, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. Later that night, riding back to the ranch under a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible to count them all, Alara said quietly, Thank you, Reed, for everything. You've said that before, Reed replied with gentle humor. I know, but I'll keep saying it, because it's true, and because some things bear repeating. She was quiet for a moment, then added, I love you. Like a father. Like family. Reed's vision blurred with tears he wasn't ashamed of. I love you too, daughter. More than I thought I'd ever love anyone again. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other in the midst of darkness and built something good and true and lasting. The ranch house came into view, windows dark but welcoming, waiting for them to bring it to life with lamplight and laughter and the simple rhythms of home. As they unsaddled the horses and settled them for the night, as they moved through the familiar routines of closing up the house and preparing for sleep, Reed found himself thinking about journeys, how they began in unexpected places, how they took you through fire and fear and fighting, and how, if you were very lucky, they ended someplace better than where you started. He'd begun this journey as a lonely rancher buying salt and wire. He'd ended it as a father, a protector, a man who'd rediscovered purpose and meaning in the last place he'd expected to find it. And Alara had begun as a silent girl on an auction block, treated as property, stripped of voice and agency and hope. She'd ended it as a young woman of property herself, yes, but more importantly as someone who'd reclaimed her power, her truth, her life. They were both different than they'd been that burning afternoon in Sierra Luce. Scarred, certainly, changed, absolutely, but also healed in the ways that mattered most. Not the erasure of wounds, but the acceptance of them. Not the forgetting of pain, but the refusal to let it define them. The next morning dawned clear and bright, promising heat, but not yet delivering it. Reed woke to the smell of coffee brewing and found Alara already up, sitting at the kitchen table with pen and paper, writing. She looked up as he entered, smiled, and went back to her work. Your story? Reed asked, pouring himself coffee. Our story, she corrected. The story of how a lonely rancher and a silenced girl found each other and refused to let evil win. How they fought together, saved each other, and built something good from the ashes of loss. She paused, tapping the pen against her lips. What do you think I should call it? Reed considered. Something about finding your voice, about speaking truth, about courage. Alara nodded slowly, writing something at the top of the page. The girl who learned to scream, she read aloud. How does that sound? Perfect, Reed said. Absolutely perfect. And as the sun climbed higher and the day's work called them both to their respective tasks, Reed to mend fences and Alara to her writing and later her teaching, the story continued. Not in dramatic confrontations or life and death struggles, but in the quiet persistence of living well, of choosing kindness, of speaking truth even when silence would be easier. Years later, when Alara's book was published and distributed throughout the territories, when it inspired other silenced voices to speak up and other lonely souls to take action against injustice, people would ask Reed what it felt like to be a hero. He always gave the same answer. I'm not the hero of this story. I just happened to be in the right place at the right moment, and I made the only choice I could live with. The real hero is the girl who survived 6 years of silence, who found the courage to scream when it mattered most, who refused to let evil have the last word. That's Alara. She's always been the hero. And if Alara was nearby when he said this, which she often was, having chosen to stay close to home and family rather than seek adventure elsewhere, She would shake her head and say, "We're both heroes, and neither of us." Because real heroism isn't about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. It's about showing up day after day, choosing right over easy, protecting those who need protection, and speaking truth even when your voice shakes. That's something anyone can do. That's something everyone should do. Then they would return to their work, their life, their home. The ranch that had started as Reed's refuge and become their shared sanctuary. A place where silence had been banished and voices rang out freely. A place where a lonely rancher had found purpose and a silenced girl had found family. A place where justice had been served and healing had taken root and love had grown from the most unlikely soil. The story could have ended a dozen different ways, most of them tragic. But through courage and stubbornness and a refusal to accept the world as it was rather than as it should be, Reed and Alara had written a different ending. One where the voiceless found their voices, where the powerless claimed their power, where a girl sold like cattle became a woman who changed her corner of the world for the better. And that, in the end, was the only ending worth having, the only ending worth fighting for, the only ending that mattered.